I slammed the front door so hard the house shook, pretending to leave after my husband screamed in my face. Sitting in my car down the street, I opened the baby monitor app to check on our 1-year-old son. Instead of a sleeping baby, I heard the sound of clinking glasses. I panned the camera to the living room and saw my husband celebrating with his family. When I heard exactly what they were celebrating, my blood ran cold. I had no idea my entire life was a lie, but they had no idea who they were really messing with. I am Meredith, 34 years old, and today I watched the man I loved plot to destroy my sanity and steal my future. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to outsmart people who thought you were weak. You are a lazy work-from-home mother who contributes absolutely nothing to this household. Bradley's voice echoed off the hallway walls, his face red with a rage that seemed to come out of nowhere. He threw his expensive leather briefcase onto the entryway table, glaring at me as if I were a stranger. I asked you to do one simple thing, Meredith. Pick up my dry cleaning. I am a vice president at a bank. I have real responsibilities. You sit at a computer in sweatpants all day. I stood there holding a laundry basket, staring at the man I had married 5 years ago. I did not raise my voice. I did not argue back. Arguing with Bradley had become a pointless exercise in recent months. Instead, I set the basket down, grabbed my car keys from the hook, and walked out the front door, pulling it shut with a resounding slam that rattled the windows. I marched to my car, started the engine, and drove exactly 2 blocks before pulling over into the shadow of a large oak tree. My hands gripped the steering wheel. My heart pounded against my ribs. Something was terribly wrong in my house, and it was not just about forgotten dry cleaning. Bradley had been picking fights all week, specifically trying to make me look unstable, forgetful, and exhausted. I pulled out my phone. My only concern at that moment was my 1-year-old son, Leo. He had been napping upstairs, and I wanted to make sure Bradley's yelling had not woken him up. I opened the baby monitor app, a high-end system I had installed myself, which allowed me to check the cameras in the nursery and the main living areas. I tapped the nursery feed. The room was empty. Leo was not in his crib. Panic spiked in my chest until I switched to the living room camera. The feed loaded and the audio connected instantly. I did not hear a crying baby. I heard the sharp, celebratory clink of crystal glasses. I zoomed in on the screen. There was Bradley, his tie loosened, laughing as he poured top-shelf bourbon. Sitting on my custom velvet sofa was his mother Beatrice, wearing her usual judgmental scowl disguised as a polite smile. Next to her was my sister-in-law Sydney, admiring her fresh manicure, and pacing the floor was Trey, Sydney's husband. Trey was an arrogant, sharply dressed African-American man who owned a high-end gym franchise downtown. Trey always looked at me like I was a peasant allowed to sit at their royal table. Where was my baby? I quickly tapped another camera feed for the downstairs playroom. Leo was sound asleep in his playpen, tucked away in the back of the house so their vile celebration would not wake him. I switched back to the living room audio just in time to hear my husband speak. "Just 2 more months," Bradley said, taking a sip of his drink. He leaned back against the mantel, looking completely relaxed. "My buddy at the clinic is finalizing her postpartum psychosis diagnosis as we speak. He has been taking all the notes I feed him." I stopped breathing. The air in my car suddenly felt too thick to inhale. "I get full custody of Leo," Bradley continued, his voice dripping with smug satisfaction. "She gets locked in a psychiatric ward for her own safety. And the best part is, since she is totally incapacitated, that useless college dropout gets absolutely zero alimony when I file for divorce." Beatrice chuckled, swirling the amber liquid in her glass. "It is about time, Bradley. I told you 5 years ago she was not our kind of people. The girl has no pedigree, no ambition, and she does not even know how to dress for a country club dinner." Sydney chimed in, tossing her hair over her shoulder. "Good. I am so tired of her acting like she belongs in this family. By the way, did you push that second mortgage through on her name? Trey needs the cash." Trey stopped pacing and looked directly at Bradley. "Yeah, man. My gym contractors are threatening to walk off the job if they do not get paid by Friday. I need that capital now." You promised me this would be seamless. Relax. Trey Bradley laughed, waving his hand dismissively. I am a bank vice president. I know exactly how to bypass the system. I pushed the home equity line of credit through this morning. $400,000, all tied to Meredith's social security number. She is just a clueless work-from-home mom. She will not notice a thing until the bank forecloses on her, and by then she will be medicated in a padded room. Trey grinned, raising his glass. To the college dropout. May she enjoy her extended vacation at the loony bin. They all laughed. A chorus of cruel, mocking laughter echoing through the tiny speaker of my phone. I sat in the driver's seat staring at the screen. I did not shed a single tear. I did not scream or hit the steering wheel. The woman they thought they knew, the fragile, exhausted mother they were plotting to destroy, died in that moment. What Bradley completely failed to understand was that I did not drop out of college because I was lazy. I dropped out because I was recruited by a private intelligence firm. I was an ethical hacker, a cybersecurity data analyst, who had literally written the security protocols his bank used. He thought I was making pennies, completely unaware that I had just quietly sold a proprietary security algorithm to a major tech conglomerate for $8 million. I calmly minimized the baby monitor app and opened my encrypted messaging platform. I typed a quick message to my private attorney. Initiate Plan B immediately. The enemy is inside the house. Just as I hit send, a bright red banner flashed across the top of my phone screen. It was a high-priority alert from my banking application. I tapped the notification and the digital receipt loaded instantly. A $400,000 home equity line of credit had just been disbursed into a joint account under my name. Bradley had actually done it. He had forged my signature and initiated a massive fraudulent loan to fund his brother-in-law's failing business. A slow, dangerous smile spread across my face. Bradley thought he was playing chess with a helpless housewife. He had no idea he had just committed federal wire fraud against a woman who monitored digital transactions for a living. I put my car in drive. It was time to go home and serve them exactly what they ordered. I pushed the heavy oak front door open, stepping into the foyer with a practiced, oblivious smile. The lively chatter in the living room died instantly. It was the sharp, guilty silence of roaches scattering when the kitchen light turns on. I walked into the living room, tossing my keys onto the glass coffee table with a loud clatter. The four of them sat exactly where they had been on the baby monitor screen. Trey was still gripping his crystal glass of bourbon, leaning back against the velvet cushions, with the unearned confidence of a man spending someone else's money. Sydney was scrolling on her phone, and Bradley stood by the fireplace adjusting his designer tie. Beatrice was the first to break the tension, launching her usual venom, disguised as maternal concern. "Where on earth have you been?" Beatrice demanded, looking me up and down with obvious disgust. "Leo has been fussy all morning. A decent mother would not vanish for an hour, leaving her child with people who actually have real jobs to worry about. And look at your hair. You look completely unhinged. You cannot expect a man of Bradley's stature to stay attracted to someone who puts zero effort into her appearance." I did not flinch. A year ago, her words would have sent me spiraling into a guilt-ridden frenzy, convinced I was failing at motherhood and failing as a wife. Now, armed with the knowledge of their plot, her malice was just background noise. I was just taking a drive to clear my head. "Beatrice?" I replied, my voice steady and light. "Sometimes the air in this house gets a little too toxic to breathe." Beatrice narrowed her eyes, ready to fire back another insult, but I did not give her the chance. I turned my back on her entirely, a move I knew would infuriate her, and focused my attention on my brother-in-law. "Trey." I smiled, stepping closer to where he sat. "Congratulations on the new gym location. I saw the promotional blast on social media this morning. The marketing reach looks incredibly expensive." Trey puffed out his chest, a smug grin spreading across his face. He adjusted the lapels of his custom-tailored jacket. "It takes real hustle and aggressive capital investment to build an empire. You have to spend big to win big. But I would not expect someone who sits at home typing on a laptop all day to understand the mechanics of scaling a physical business. You have to take risks." I kept the bright, naive smile plastered on my face. You are absolutely right. I do not understand how you fund it. In fact, it is a shame about my Chase Sapphire card. Trey's smug grin vanished. He froze the glass of bourbon hovering inches from his mouth. What about your card? He asked, his voice suddenly losing its arrogant bass. The bank flagged it for suspicious activity this morning, I explained, looking innocently between Trey and Bradley. Someone racked up exactly $10,000 in Facebook and Instagram advertising charges overnight. Can you believe the nerve of some people stealing from a mother to fund their little online campaigns? Trey swallowed hard, coughing as the bourbon caught in his throat. He hacked his chest, heaving his eyes darting frantically toward Bradley. The liquid splashed onto his pristine white shirt, but he did not even seem to notice. Bradley stepped forward, his face draining of color. He looked like a man who had just stepped on a landmine. You canceled the card? Bradley asked, his voice tight, demanding an answer. Why did you not tell me first? I could have looked into it. I am a vice president at the bank. I know how to handle these internal flags better than some automated hotline. Oh, I did not want to bother you with my silly little financial issues, I said, sweetly tilting my head. You always say I need to be more independent, so I handled it myself. I froze the account, disputed the charges, and filed a comprehensive identity theft report with the Federal Trade Commission. Sydney dropped her phone. The heavy thud against the hardwood floor echoed through the silent room. You called the feds! She shrieked, her voice pitching into a hysterical frequency. Over a credit card charge. Are you insane? Identity theft is a federal crime. Sydney, I replied, turning my innocent gaze on her. The fraud department assured me they take wire fraud very seriously. They will be tracking the IP address of whoever initiated the ad campaign. Whoever did it is looking at federal charges. Bradley gripped the edge of the mantel. His knuckles turned white. As a bank executive, he knew exactly what an FTC investigation meant. A federal fraud alert tied to his residential address would automatically trigger an internal compliance audit at his workplace. If they dug into the IP logs, they would find his brother-in-law's business. If they kept digging, they would find the $400,000 home equity line of credit he had just fraudulently authorized. His career, his freedom, everything was suddenly dangling by a thread. You are overreacting, Bradley said, forcing a harsh, condescending laugh. He walked toward me, his hands raised in a placating gesture. This is exactly what Dr. Evans was warning me about. You are stressed. You are hyper-fixated on minor inconveniences and blowing them out of proportion. I am protecting my assets, Bradley. You are being paranoid, he countered, his voice lowering into that calm, authoritative tone he always used when he was trying to gaslight me into submission. You have not been sleeping well since Leo was born. Your mind is playing tricks on you. You are seeing enemies where there are none. You need to relax before you make yourself sick. He turned toward the kitchen. Let me get you something to calm your nerves. Just sit down and stop talking. I remained standing, watching the three of them exchange terrified, frantic glances while Bradley's back was turned. Sydney was mouthing the word feds to Trey, who was furiously typing on his phone, likely trying to pause his ad campaigns before the fraud department locked him out completely. Beatrice simply glared at me, her fists clenched tightly in her lap, her upper lip curling in undisguised hatred. A minute later, Bradley returned from the kitchen. He was holding a glass of warm almond milk. He held it out to me, his eyes dark and unblinking. Drink this, babe, he said softly. His voice was dripping with fake affection, but his gaze was entirely predatory. It will help you sleep. Your doctor specifically said you need to start taking better care of your fragile mental state. Drink it all. I looked at the warm, creamy liquid in the glass, then up at my husband's cold, calculating eyes. I knew exactly what he was trying to do. He was trying to sedate me to document my lethargy to build his fake postpartum psychosis case so he could steal my son and my freedom. I reached out and wrapped my fingers around the glass. I raised the glass of warm almond milk to my lips, maintaining eye contact with Bradley. His unblinking stare was suffocating silently, demanding my total submission. I tilted the glass upward. The thick liquid hit my bottom lip, but I kept my mouth tightly shut. With a sudden, deliberate jerk of my wrist, I sent the milk sloshing down my chin and cascading all over the front of my silk blouse. I let out a sharp, dramatic gasp, intentionally fumbling the glass so it slammed down onto the kitchen counter with a loud clatter. Bradley rolled his eyes, his mask of a loving, concerned husband slipping instantly. He muttered a string of curses under his breath about my unbearable clumsiness, snatching a dish towel from the oven handle and throwing it at my chest. I grabbed the towel, acting completely flustered, and scooped up the half-full glass of milk. I rushed down the hall to the master bathroom, pulling the door shut and locking it with a swift click. My hands were shaking, but my mind was entirely focused. I grabbed an empty travel-size shampoo bottle from my toiletry bag, rinsed it out with scalding hot water, and poured the remaining almond milk from the glass directly into the small plastic container. I capped it tightly and shoved it deep into the hidden zippered pocket of my purse. I dumped the rest of the milk down the sink, washed the glass until it was spotless, and wiped the sticky mess from my face and chest. I walked back out to the kitchen, handing Bradley the empty glass with a tired, compliant smile. He looked at the clean glass and nodded, completely satisfied that his obedient, fragile wife had swallowed every drop of his poison. The next morning, the second Bradley's car pulled out of the driveway to head to the bank. I was out the door. I bypassed the standard local hospitals where Bradley might have professional connections and drove straight to a private high-end toxicology clinic downtown. I walked up to the reception desk and placed the plastic bottle on the cold marble counter. The lab technician, a stern woman in a crisp white coat, looked at the bottle and then looked up at my plain sweatpants and messy bun. She informed me that an expedited full-spectrum chemical analysis would cost $1,200 out of pocket. She asked if I wanted to consult with my husband or my insurance provider first, her tone dripping with the assumption that a stressed stay-at-home mother could not possibly afford such a luxury without permission. I did not argue. I reached into my wallet and slid a heavy, solid metal credit card across the counter. The technician's eyes widened as she processed the premium tier card. She swiped it, handing it back with a sudden drastic shift in respect. She asked what exactly I did for a living to require such urgent private testing. I looked her dead in the eye and told her the truth. I am not the useless college dropout my husband tells his country club friends about. 6 years ago, I walked out of my university's computer science program because sitting in a classroom listening to outdated theory was a waste of my time. I had already written a proprietary data encryption algorithm in my dorm room. I dropped out to found my own cybersecurity firm. I built it from the ground up, and just last week, I finalized the sale of that company to a major Silicon Valley tech conglomerate. The payout was $8 million. Every single cent was immediately routed into an irrevocable blind trust that I control completely. My husband thinks I make a meager salary doing freelance tech support. He has no idea he is currently trying to destroy a multimillionaire. I left the clinic and drove straight back to my house. I had exactly 2 hours before the rush lab results would be ready. I walked into Bradley's home office and locked the door behind me. Sitting perfectly centered on his mahogany desk was his bank-issued laptop. Bradley always boasted about the bank's military-grade encryption, constantly mocking my freelance work by claiming his corporate security was an impenetrable fortress. I pulled a small, modified USB drive from my pocket. It was a custom script execution tool I had coded myself specifically for penetrating banking firewalls. I inserted it into his laptop port. It took exactly 14 seconds for my software to dismantle his impenetrable corporate security and grant me full administrative access to his hard drive. I began pulling his local files, searching for anything tied to his brother-in-law's gym or the forged home equity line of credit he had opened in my name. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was an encrypted email from the toxicology lab. I opened the attachment, my heart hammering against my ribs. The chemical breakdown of the almond milk was right there in black and white. It was laced with a massive dose of quetiapine. I read the clinical notes below the chemical name, the pieces of Bradley's twisted puzzle snapping into place. Quetiapine was a heavy antipsychotic medication. In individuals without schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, A dose this high would induce severe lethargy, extreme confusion, slurred speech, and vivid hallucinations. Bradley was intentionally poisoning me with a dangerous cocktail designed to perfectly mimic a severe postpartum psychotic break. He was using the pills prescribed by his fraternity brother at the clinic to manufacture a medical emergency. A cold, absolute fury washed over me. I looked back at Bradley's computer screen to continue my search, but I did not need to dig any further. Sitting right on his desktop was a freshly saved PDF file. I clicked it open. It was an emergency involuntary commitment order. The legal document detailed a completely fabricated history of my aggressive delusional behavior. It formally requested that I be forcibly removed from my home by law enforcement and placed in a locked psychiatric facility for a mandatory 72-hour hold. My name was typed at the very top of the order. At the bottom of the page, Bradley's signature was already perfectly signed, dated for this coming Friday. I stared at the digital signature on the screen, the cold reality of his timeline locking into place. Today was Wednesday. Bradley intended to have me strapped to a gurney by Friday night. I did not have time to process the sheer evil of his schedule because a heavy, aggressive pounding suddenly echoed from the front door. It was not a polite neighborly knock. It was the distinct, demanding thud of law enforcement. I closed the laptop, slipped my modified USB drive into my pocket, and walked out of the home office. As I descended the staircase, I saw Bradley standing in the foyer. He was not alone. Two uniformed police officers stood on our hardwood floor, their hands resting cautiously near their utility belts. Beside them stood a woman with a clipboard wearing a badge that identified her as a county crisis intervention worker. Bradley was currently giving the performance of his life. He was weeping. Actual tears streamed down his face as he clutched the edge of the entryway table for support. "Officers, you have to help me," Bradley sobbed, his voice cracking with manufactured despair. "She is having a complete psychotic break. She has not slept in days. She is refusing her medication, and I am terrified she is going to hurt our infant son. I just want my wife back. I just want her to be safe." The social worker looked at Bradley with deep, profound sympathy before turning her gaze up the stairs to me. Her eyes were full of pity, treating me instantly like a ticking time bomb. "Meredith," the social worker said, using a slow, excessively gentle tone you would use to coax a stray dog out of an alley. "My name is Sarah. Your husband is very worried about you. We just want to ask you a few questions to make sure you and the baby are safe." I walked calmly down the remaining stairs, my posture perfectly straight, my expression entirely neutral. I did not scream. I did not act defensive. I knew that any display of anger would only validate Bradley's fabricated claims. "I am perfectly fine, Sarah," I said, keeping my voice steady and professional. "My husband is lying to you to facilitate an illegal eviction and secure full custody of our son." Bradley let out a loud theatrical gasp, covering his mouth with his hand. "You see," he cried, turning to the officers, "the paranoia is escalating. She thinks everyone is conspiring against her. I have proof. I set up hidden cameras because I was so worried about what she was doing when I was at the bank." Bradley pulled his high-end tablet from his briefcase and tapped the screen. He handed it to the taller police officer, and Sarah, the social worker, leaned in to watch. "Look at her," Bradley whispered, wiping a fake tear from his cheek. "She is completely detached from reality." I stepped closer, maintaining a respectful distance from the officers, and glanced at the screen. The video playing on the tablet showed me standing in our kitchen wearing the exact clothes I had worn yesterday. In the footage, I was pacing erratically, sweeping my arms through the air and screaming violently at the empty wall. It was a horrifying, disturbing visual. It was also completely fake. The police officer looked at me, his expression hardening. "Ma'am, given this footage, we are going to have to ask you to come with us to the hospital for a mandatory psychiatric evaluation." I did not flinch. Instead, I reached into the back pocket of my jeans and pulled out the thick stack of papers I had just printed from Bradley's compromised hard drive. "Officer," I said, maintaining absolute eye contact, "I am sure my husband told you he is a vice president at a regional bank. What he conveniently omitted is that I am a senior data privacy and cybersecurity architect." Bradley's fake crying stopped instantly. His head snapped toward me, his eyes widening in confusion. I handed the stack of papers directly to the social worker. If you look closely at that video, I continued, my voice ringing clear and authoritative through the foyer. You will notice that the shadows underneath my bare feet do not match the directional lighting of the kitchen windows. That is because the video was not recorded by a hidden camera. It is a deep fake generated using artificial intelligence. And those papers you are holding contain the absolute proof. Sarah, the social worker, flipped through the pages, her brow furrowing as she looked at rows of complex digital logs. I highlighted the relevant sections for your convenience, I explained calmly. Those are the IP addresses, metadata logs, and server rendering timestamps I pulled from my husband's computer 10 minutes ago. He did not just fabricate a video to frame his wife for a mental breakdown. He rendered the video yesterday afternoon using the highly secure encrypted servers at his bank. He stole corporate computing power to manufacture evidence for a false police report. Bradley lunged forward, trying to snatch the papers out of the social worker's hands. "Give me that. She is lying. She fabricated those papers to frame me." The taller police officer immediately stepped between us, placing a firm hand on Bradley's chest and pushing him back. "Back up, sir." The officer barked, his tone shifting from sympathetic to fiercely suspicious. I smiled at Bradley, enjoying the sheer panic radiating from his pale face. I already forwarded the complete digital forensic file to the bank's chief compliance officer and the Federal Cybercrimes Division. "I imagine your Human Resources Department will be calling you very shortly, Bradley." The social worker handed the tablet back to Bradley, her face tight with disgust. She looked at the police officers and nodded sharply. "This is a domestic dispute involving digital fraud," she stated firmly. "This is not a psychiatric emergency. We are leaving." The officers glared at Bradley. "If you ever waste our time by filing a false emergency report again, you will be leaving this house in handcuffs," the taller officer warned. Bradley stood frozen, his jaw clenched so tightly a muscle twitched in his cheek. He watched in humiliated silence as the social worker and the police officers walked out the front door, leaving him completely exposed. As soon as the heavy door clicked shut, the fake tears vanished. Bradley's face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. He closed the distance between us, backing me up against the entryway wall. He did not touch me, knowing better than to leave a physical mark, but he leaned in so close I could feel the heat of his angry breath on my face. "You think you are so smart," he hissed, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "You think you just won. You did not win anything, Meredith. You still owe $400,000 on the home equity loan I took out against this house this morning. I will drain the accounts, force a partition sale, and leave you rotting on the street with absolutely nothing. You are ruined." I did not cower. I did not look away. I simply tilted my head and smiled, a genuine, terrifying smile that made him take a half step back. "You should really check the county property registry, Bradley," I whispered back, my voice smooth as glass. "I have not owned this house for a year." I left Bradley standing frozen in the entryway of a house he no longer had any legal claim to, his face pale and his breathing shallow. 48 hours later, the neon lights of downtown illuminated the polished concrete floors of Trey's brand new flagship fitness center. It was Friday night, the evening of the grand opening, and the entire family was determined to put on a flawless public performance. The facility was an obscene display of stolen wealth. Velvet ropes lined a literal red carpet outside the entrance. Inside, local fitness influencers posed for photos in front of a custom botanical wall bearing the gym's logo in glowing white neon. Waiters in crisp black uniforms circulated through the crowd, balancing silver trays loaded with imported caviar and flutes of expensive champagne. Rows of top-tier imported weight machines gleamed under the industrial track lighting. I arrived an hour late, wearing a tailored emerald green silk jumpsuit that cost more than Bradley made in a month, courtesy of my blind trust. I walked through the sliding glass doors with absolute confidence. I spotted Bradley immediately. He was standing near the juice bar, sweating profusely despite the heavy air conditioning, downing his third glass of whiskey. He had spent the last 2 days frantically tearing through our filing cabinets and screaming at his real estate attorney on the phone, trying to figure out how I had transferred the deed of the house into an anonymous corporate LLC without him noticing. He had absolutely no leverage left, but he was forced to stand here and smile for his sister's big night. Beatrice was holding court near the free weight section draped in heavy gold jewelry, loudly boasting to a group of local socialites about her brilliant son-in-law's entrepreneurial spirit. Then Sydney spotted me. She marched across the room, her designer heels clicking sharply against the concrete. She was wearing a skin-tight metallic dress, acting less like a gym owner's wife and more like an A-list celebrity gracing the peasants with her presence. She looked me up and down, her lip curling in a sneer of pure, undisguised entitlement. "I cannot believe you actually showed up!" Sydney scoffed, her voice intentionally loud enough to draw the attention of the surrounding guests. "I thought Bradley was having you committed." "He tried," I said, keeping my voice light and pleasant. "Turns out federal agents take a very dim view of bank executives fabricating medical records." Sydney's eyes narrowed. She had no idea what I was talking about, completely oblivious to the fact that her husband's business was funded by wire fraud. She simply assumed I was lying to save face. She turned around and grabbed a heavy black industrial trash bag from a nearby catering cart. With a cruel, dismissive smirk, she shoved the plastic bag directly into my chest. "Since you do not have a real job and clearly have nothing better to do, you can make yourself useful tonight," Sydney announced, projecting her voice so a group of influencers with their cameras rolling would hear her. "The catering staff is overwhelmed. Go around the room and bust the empty cocktail glasses. Try not to break anything. We actually paid for these." The surrounding guests fell completely silent. A few people gasped. Beatrice watched from across the room, a satisfied grin stretching across her face. They all waited for me to flush with humiliation, to lower my head and scurry away in tears, just like the old Meredith would have done. I did not blink. I maintained perfectly calm eye contact with Sydney. I let my arms drop to my sides. The heavy trash bag slipped from my chest and plummeted to the floor, landing squarely on top of Sydney's open-toed designer heels. A half-empty bottle of sparkling water inside the bag shattered on impact. Iced water and wet trash seeped out over her expensive leather shoes. Sydney let out a piercing shriek, jumping backward and frantically shaking her wet foot. "You clumsy idiot!" I stepped right over the trash bag, completely ignoring her tantrum, and walked purposefully toward the front of the room. Trey had set up a small raised platform with a microphone and a speaker system for his upcoming ribbon-cutting toast. I stepped onto the platform, adjusting the microphone stand with a sharp screech of feedback that instantly commanded the attention of every single person in the massive room. The music cut out. The chatter died. "Good evening, everyone," I said, my voice ringing clear and steady through the speakers. I raised an empty hand in the air, as if holding a glass. "I want to take a quick moment to raise a toast to my brother-in-law, Trey." Trey puffed out his chest, completely oblivious to the trap I was laying. He wrapped an arm around Sydney, who was still glaring at me while trying to wipe garbage water off her ankle. Bradley, however, froze. He stared at me from the juice bar, his eyes wide with rising terror. "Building $1 million facility like this is no small feat." I continued pacing slowly across the small stage. "It takes immense capital. And I just think it is incredibly inspiring that Trey managed to do all of this entirely on his own. He did not use a single angel investor. He did not secure a legitimate small business loan from a commercial lender. He funded this entire luxury empire entirely on his own dime, with cash he claims to have manifested out of thin air. Let us hear it for Trey, the self-made man." The crowd broke into polite, enthusiastic applause. Trey beamed, soaking in the praise, raising his hands in a victory wave. He was so blindingly arrogant that he did not realize I had just publicly cornered him into claiming ownership of stolen funds. Bradley dropped his whiskey glass. It shattered on the concrete. He knew exactly what I had just done. Trey grabbed the microphone from its stand, stepping up to take over the speech. "Thank you, Meredith." Trey boomed, flashing his perfect teeth to the crowd. "It is true. Hard work, relentless grind, and a massive amount of personal capital. That is what it takes to be a boss." The heavy glass front doors of the gym suddenly slid open with a loud mechanical whir. The automatic sensor chimed, cutting through the echoes of Trey's applause. Two men stepped onto the red carpet. They were not wearing trendy workout gear. They were not holding champagne flutes. They were dressed in stark, identical dark windbreakers, with bold yellow lettering stamped across their chests. They walked with the heavy, synchronized stride of federal law enforcement, their eyes locking immediately onto Trey, standing on the stage. The taller of the two men reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a leather wallet, flipping it open to display a gleaming gold badge. His voice boomed across the silent, staring crowd. IRS Criminal Investigation Division. We need to speak to the legal owner of this establishment right now regarding an unreported $400,000 wire transfer. The music in the gym cut out completely, replaced by the heavy, suffocating silence of a room full of people realizing they were witnessing a spectacular downfall. I did not stick around to watch Trey stammer and sweat his way through a pathetic explanation of federal wire fraud to the IRS agents. I slipped out the side door, leaving the entire family to drown in the absolute chaos of their own making. By Monday morning, Bradley's bank accounts were entirely frozen, Trey's flagship fitness center was an active crime scene, and the family's meticulously crafted public image was in ruins. But cornered rats are the most dangerous animals on earth. I knew the family would not just sit back and watch their empire crumble. They would strike at the only vulnerability I had left. I knew exactly what their next move would be. I pulled my car into the circular, pristine driveway of Oak Ridge Preparatory Academy just before 9 o'clock. It was the ridiculously expensive, highly exclusive early learning center where I had enrolled my infant son, Leo. The second I stepped through the heavy glass doors and into the mahogany-paneled reception area, I heard her. Beatrice's voice was a practiced, mournful whisper, carrying clearly through the daycare director's open office door. "It is a complete and utter tragedy," Mrs. Higgins Beatrice was saying, dabbing her dry eyes with a monogrammed silk handkerchief. "My son is completely devastated. Meredith suffered a severe postpartum psychotic break over the weekend. She has been involuntarily committed to a secure lockdown psychiatric facility. I have come to collect Leo. He will be staying at my estate indefinitely until the courts grant Bradley full emergency custody." I stepped quietly toward the open doorway. Beatrice was sitting across from the academy director, sliding a crisp, official-looking document across the desk. It was undoubtedly another one of Bradley's brilliant forgeries. "That is a fascinating fairy tale, Beatrice," I said, my voice cutting through the quiet office like the crack of a whip. "But I am standing right here completely sane and fully retaining every single one of my parental rights." Beatrice jumped so hard her heavy gold bracelets clattered against the wooden desk. She spun around to face me, her jaw dropping open. The color drained from her face, leaving her looking old and incredibly fragile under the bright office lights. Mrs. Higgins, the director, looked frantically between us, her hands hovering nervously over the forged paperwork. I walked into the room maintaining perfect, unbothered posture. "You are committing fraud, Beatrice," I stated plainly. "Attempting to kidnap a child using fabricated legal documents is a federal offense. I highly suggest you take your fake papers and walk out of this building before I have you arrested." Beatrice realized instantly that her grand kidnapping attempt had failed. The forged custody paperwork sitting on the desk was suddenly a massive, undeniable liability. She snatched the papers back, her eyes darting frantically around the reception area. The main lobby featured a small, three-step decorative marble staircase leading up to the toddler wing. Beatrice backed out of the office and moved slowly toward those steps, her eyes locked onto mine, burning with sheer, unadulterated malice. She knew her son was facing federal charges. She knew her family was financially ruined. She wanted blood. "If I cannot take him legally," Beatrice hissed under her breath, her voice dripping with venom, "I will make sure they lock you up for assault. You will never see that boy again." Without breaking eye contact, Beatrice threw her arms backward. She deliberately and forcefully launched her own body backward down the 3 marble steps. She hit the floor with a loud, theatrical shriek, twisting her body to make the impact look as brutal and damaging as possible. Her designer purse went flying across the tile. She immediately began wailing at the top of her lungs, clutching her ankle and screaming for help. "She pushed me," Beatrice shrieked, pointing a trembling accusatory finger directly at my chest as daycare teachers and security guards rushed into the lobby. "My daughter-in-law is completely unhinged. She shoved me down the stairs. Call the police right now. She is trying to kill me." 10 minutes later, two patrol officers walked through the front doors of the academy. Beatrice was putting on an Oscar-worthy performance. She was sobbing hysterically into a teacher's shoulder, claiming her hip was fractured, crying that I was a violent psychopath, and begging the officers to protect her infant grandson from my violent rage. The older police officer approached me immediately. His hand was resting cautiously on his utility belt. He looked at my calm demeanor with deep suspicion, buying entirely into the narrative of the wealthy, battered grandmother. "Ma'am," the officer barked, his tone hard and commanding. "I need you to step away from the office. Turn around and place your hands behind your back. You are being detained for the assault of an elderly woman." I did not argue. I did not raise my voice. I did not give them any reason to believe I was a threat. I simply looked past the officer directly at the daycare director, who was standing in the doorway trembling. "Mrs. Higgins," I said smoothly, my voice echoing through the tense, silent lobby. "When I overhauled the Academy's cybersecurity protocols last year, I also upgraded your lobby surveillance to a cloud-based high-definition system. Could you please cast Camera 4 to the main reception monitor?" Beatrice's fake sobbing stopped instantly. She froze on the floor. Mrs. Higgins, looking pale and terrified, tapped a few buttons on her administrative tablet. The large flat-screen television mounted on the lobby wall flickered to life. The security footage played back in crystal-clear 4K resolution. The video showed me standing completely still, my arms folded across my chest a full 5 feet away from the staircase. It showed Beatrice looking around the lobby, positioning herself perfectly, and then deliberately throwing her own body backward down the marble steps. The two police officers stared at the television screen in absolute dead silence. The video looped, showing the ridiculous self-inflicted fall a second time. The older officer turned slowly away from the screen and looked down at Beatrice, who was still sitting on the floor, her mouth opening and closing like a trapped fish. He pulled a heavy citation pad from his breast pocket. "Ma'am," the officer said, his voice dripping with absolute disgust. "You can get up now. You are being cited for filing a false police report. And if you ever try to weaponize my department again, you will be leaving this building in handcuffs." I left the academy with Leo safely buckled into the back seat of my SUV. The satisfying image of Beatrice sitting humiliated on the lobby floor burned into my memory. But the war was far from over. Bradley was a cornered animal, and men like him only knew how to double down when their control started slipping. When I pulled into the driveway of our house, Bradley's car was already parked at a jagged angle. He had clearly rushed home. I carried Leo inside in his car seat, setting him gently on the living room rug. Sitting perfectly centered on the kitchen island was a thick, oversized envelope with a bright red certified mail sticker. It had already been torn open. Bradley stood by the sink. His tie was loosened, his sleeves rolled up, and his hair was uncharacteristically messy. He looked like a man who had spent the last 48 hours watching his carefully constructed empire burn to the ground. Trey's gym was under federal investigation, his mother was facing criminal charges for filing a false police report, and his career at the bank was undoubtedly hanging by a thread. Yet as he looked at me, a sickening, triumphant smirk spread across his face. He picked up the stack of papers from the torn envelope and slapped them down hard onto the granite countertop. "It is over," Meredith Bradley announced, his voice dripping with absolute superiority. "That is a formal notice of pre-foreclosure. The bank is calling in the $400,000 home equity line of credit. The entire balance is due immediately. Since your name is on the deed, you are the primary debtor. You are legally responsible for a debt you cannot possibly pay." I walked slowly toward the island, keeping my expression entirely neutral. I did not reach for the papers. I simply looked at him, waiting for the rest of his pitch. I knew exactly what he was trying to do. He was manufacturing a financial catastrophe to force me into submission. "You are drowning," Meredith Bradley continued, stepping closer, trying to use his physical size to intimidate me. "The bank is going to seize this house. They are going to freeze your checking accounts, destroy your credit, and drag you into court. You will be penniless, homeless, and legally marked as a massive financial liability. No family court judge in this state is going to give custody of a child to an unemployed, bankrupt mother with a documented history of erratic behavior. He leaned against the counter, crossing his arms, looking down at me as if I were a foolish, helpless child who had wandered too close to traffic. "But I am willing to be reasonable," Bradley said, lowering his voice to a smooth, patronizing whisper. "I still care about you despite everything you have done. I have connections at the bank. I can make this entire debt go away. I can clear your name and stop the foreclosure before the paperwork is even filed with the county. I will fix this massive mess for you." "And what is the price for this miracle?" I asked, my voice calm and completely devoid of emotion. Bradley smiled, thinking he had won. "It is simple. You sign over full, unshared legal and physical custody of Leo to me today. You agree to an uncontested divorce where you walk away and I will handle the bank. If you refuse, I will let the foreclosure proceed and I will watch the state rip our son out of your arms because you cannot even afford to feed him." A cold, absolute silence fell over the kitchen. He was actually using our infant son as a bargaining chip in his twisted game of financial extortion. I looked at the pre-foreclosure notice resting on the granite counter. Then I looked back at my husband. "You really think I am terrified of this, do you not?" Bradley let out a sharp, mocking laugh, shaking his head as if he could not believe my stupidity. "Look at you, Meredith. You are completely delusional. You have never made more than $40,000 a year in your entire life. You sit in your home office doing freelance tech support, pretending you run a real business. You are a college dropout who plays with computers all day. You cannot afford a lawyer. You cannot afford to fight a regional bank. And you definitely cannot afford a $400,000 default. You are ruined. You have absolutely nothing." I did not raise my voice. I did not argue with his assessment of my earning potential. I reached into my purse and pulled out a crisp, heavy linen folder containing the legal documents from my blind trust, along with the digital forensic logs I had pulled from his laptop earlier that week. I dropped the folder onto the island right next to the bank's foreclosure notice. "You are absolutely right about one thing, Bradley," I said, my tone shifting from conversational to icy corporate precision. "I did not sign that home equity line of credit. I never stepped foot in your bank, and I never authorized a loan against this property. You forged my signature on the master promissory note to secure cash for Trey's gym." Bradley rolled his eyes, utterly unbothered. "Good luck proving that. I processed the loan myself. The bank system shows your signature. The debt is tied to your name and this house." I smiled. It was a cold, sharp smile that finally made the confident smirk slide right off his face. "That is where your brilliant banking scheme falls apart, Bradley," I said, tapping the linen folder, "because I transferred the deed of this property into an irrevocable blind trust nearly a year ago. Legally, I do not own this house. The trust owns it. Therefore, this property could not legally be used as collateral for a personal line of credit." Bradley frowned, his brow furrowing as he tried to process my words. "That is impossible. The loan was approved. The funds were dispersed. The system required a hard asset for collateral." "Exactly," I replied, stepping right into his personal space. "When your bank's automated underwriting software realized the primary asset on the application was invalid due to the trust shield, its security protocols immediately defaulted to the secondary asset listed by the guarantor. The loan software automatically collateralized the debt against the cosigner's primary residence." Bradley's face drained of all color. He stared at me, his eyes widening in absolute horror as the realization hit him like a freight train. His mouth fell open, but no words came out. I picked up the foreclosure notice and slid it directly across the granite counter until it bumped against his hands. "Check the address on the second page," I whispered, watching his entire world implode. "You mortgaged your mother's house, Bradley." I turned my back on Bradley as he stood paralyzed in our kitchen, his eyes glued to the foreclosure notice bearing his mother's address. I did not wait for the inevitable explosion of rage. I simply picked up my purse, walked out the front door, and drove away. I had a meeting with my wealth manager later that afternoon. But first, I needed a quiet place to finalize the digital trail I was preparing to hand over to the federal prosecutor. I parked outside a high-end minimalist coffee shop downtown, the kind of place that charged $12 for a pour-over and catered strictly to corporate executives. I ordered a black coffee, took a seat at a quiet corner table, and opened my laptop. For exactly 45 minutes, my morning was entirely peaceful. Then the heavy glass door of the cafe violently slammed open. Sydney marched into the shop. She looked absolutely nothing like the glamorous, untouchable woman who had handed me a trash bag at the gym's grand opening just a few days prior. Her designer athleisure wear was wrinkled. Her hair was pulled into a messy, uneven knot, and her mascara was smudged underneath her bloodshot eyes. She marched directly up to the counter, shoved past a man waiting for his order, and snatched a freshly poured scalding hot latte right out of the barista's hand. She spun around, her frantic eyes scanning the room until they locked onto me. Sydney stomped across the polished concrete floor, completely ignoring the loud protests of the barista and the shocked stares of the other patrons. She stopped right in front of my table, her chest heaving, her knuckles white as she gripped the cardboard coffee cup. "You did this?" Sydney shrieked, her voice cracking with pure hysteria. "You vindictive, jealous psychopath! You called the IRS!" I kept my hands resting lightly on my laptop keyboard. I did not break eye contact. I did not raise my voice. "I have no idea what you are talking about, Sydney," I replied smoothly. "Do not lie to me!" she screamed, slamming her free hand down on my table so hard my coffee cup rattled. The feds showed up at our house at 6 in the morning. They froze all of Trey's business accounts. They padlocked the gym doors. He cannot even pay the utility bills, let alone the catering staff from the opening. "You ruined my husband because you are a miserable, unemployed loser who cannot stand seeing us succeed." Sydney let out a guttural scream of frustration. Without a single second of warning, she reared back and hurled the scalding hot latte directly at my face. But I knew Sydney. I knew she severely lacked emotional regulation, and I had been watching her white-knuckled grip on that cup since she snatched it. I simply planted my feet, pushed my rolling chair violently backward, and stepped completely to the side. The boiling liquid sailed through the empty space where my head had just been. The latte smashed against the exposed brick wall behind me, sending hot milk and shattered cardboard raining down onto an empty leather armchair. The entire coffee shop gasped in unison. The manager rushed out from behind the counter, pulling a cell phone from his apron and loudly declaring he was calling the police. I held up a single calm hand to the manager. "That will not be necessary," I told him, projecting my voice so the whole room could hear. "She is leaving right now." I turned my attention back to my sister-in-law. Sydney was staring at her empty hands, panting heavily, looking slightly shocked by her own loss of physical control. "You really should pay better attention to the company you keep, Sydney," I said, taking a slow, deliberate step toward her. I did not call the IRS. I did not have to. The federal government tends to notice when $400,000 of stolen corporate funds are suddenly wired into a newly registered commercial bank account. Sydney blinked, her brow furrowing in deep confusion. "What are you talking about? Trey got an angel investor. He secured private funding." I let out a short, hollow laugh. "There is no angel investor, Sydney. There is only your brother Bradley. He forged loan documents using his bank's secure servers. He bypassed standard collateral checks and wired that stolen money directly to Trey to fund that ridiculous gym. Your husband did not build an empire. You are married to a money launderer." Sydney shook her head aggressively, completely refusing to process the reality of the situation. "You are lying. You are just trying to get inside my head. Trey would never do that. He is a legitimate businessman. He told me the gym was fully capitalized. He even showed me the financial buffers. He said we had my personal family trust fund to fall back on if the initial operating costs ran too high. He is a provider." I stared at her, genuinely marveling at her absolute blindness. The sheer arrogance it took to trust a man like Trey was staggering. "Your personal trust fund?" I repeated, keeping my tone deadly quiet. "The one your grandfather left entirely in your name?" "Yes," Sydney snapped, lifting her chin with a desperate shred of pride. "My money. The money we share because we are a team." I slowly closed my laptop and slid it into my leather bag. When federal agents freeze commercial accounts during an active criminal investigation, they freeze everything tied to the business. But criminal defense attorneys, especially the high-end ones, Trey will desperately need to avoid a federal prison sentence, do not work on credit. They require massive immediate cash retainers up front. Retainers that have to be paid before the government locks down personal assets. Sydney stared at me. The color began to rapidly drain from her face. If you are such a team, Sydney, I suggested, gesturing casually toward her designer purse. Pull out your phone right now. Open your mobile banking app. Look at your joint accounts. Look at your untouchable family trust fund. Sydney's hands began to shake uncontrollably. She unzipped her bag, pulled out her phone, and fumbled wildly with her passcode. Her breathing hitched as she opened the banking application. I watched her eyes dart across the glowing screen. I watched the exact moment her denial shattered into a million irreparable pieces. Her phone slipped from her trembling fingers and clattered loudly onto the concrete floor. Trey had not just lied about the business, he had panicked. Knowing the IRS was coming for everything, he had completely drained her personal trust fund to pay his legal retainer. He took every single cent her grandfather had left her to save his own skin, leaving her with absolutely $0. I stepped over Sydney's dropped phone without a second glance. The heavy glass door of the coffee shop swung shut behind me, cutting off the chaotic sounds of her spiraling breakdown. I walked briskly to my SUV, slipped into the driver's seat, and locked the doors. The morning air was sharp, but my mind was completely clear. I pulled out of the parking lot and merged onto the busy downtown avenue. 3 blocks later, my rearview mirror caught something out of place. A dark gray, unremarkable sedan was hovering exactly 2 car lengths behind me. When I switched lanes to bypass a slow-moving delivery truck, the sedan mirrored my movement perfectly. I maintained my speed and took the next right turn. The gray car followed. I took another right turn, circling the commercial block. The sedan stayed securely in my blind spot. Nobody takes 4 consecutive right turns on a Tuesday morning unless they are lost or they are following someone. I was definitely being tailed. Bradley was becoming predictable in his desperation. With his financial world collapsing and his mother facing criminal charges, his only remaining leverage was Leo. He needed me to lose custody, and to do that, he needed me to look completely unhinged. A frantic, paranoid mother fleeing from unseen enemies would play perfectly into the narrative he had carefully fed the daycare director. He had hired a private investigator to shadow my every move, hoping to catch me acting erratic or unstable. I smiled, keeping my eyes fixed on the road ahead. I was not going to give his hired ghost a chaotic car chase. I was going to give him a technological dead end. I activated my turn signal and steered my SUV away from the open highway, heading straight for the industrial edge of the city. I navigated toward a massive, aging concrete parking structure attached to an abandoned shopping plaza. It was a notorious architectural dead zone. The thick, reinforced concrete walls and heavy steel rebar essentially functioned as a Faraday cage, completely blocking all cellular reception. I drove up the spiraling ramp, the tires squealing softly against the painted concrete. I bypassed the well-lit lower levels and climbed directly to the 4th floor. It was deserted, shadowy, and bitterly cold under the flickering fluorescent overhead lights. I backed my SUV into a corner spot, cutting the engine and killing my headlights. Less than a minute later, the gray sedan crept up the ramp. The driver parked near the stairwell, keeping a safe, calculated distance. He killed his engine. He was trying to be invisible, but in an empty concrete bunker, his presence was glaringly obvious. I remained perfectly still in the driver's seat. I reached into my leather tote bag and pulled out my laptop, opening the lid so the screen cast a pale bluish glow across the dashboard. I did not need cellular service for what I was about to do. I reached into the center console and retrieved a small, unassuming black device with 2 protruding antennas. It was a portable network router, customized for penetration testing, commonly known as a Wi-Fi pineapple. I connected the device to my laptop and initiated the software. The private investigator sitting in the gray sedan was currently staring at a smartphone with 0 bars of service. He was trapped in a concrete box, unable to text Bradley his location unable to upload his surveillance photos, and completely cut off from the outside world. Modern smartphones and smart dashcams are programmed to aggressively hunt for connectivity when they lose their cellular signal. They constantly broadcast background probes, searching for previously saved open Wi-Fi networks to re-establish a connection to the internet. I typed a command into my terminal interface deploying a localized evil twin attack. My custom router instantly began broadcasting dozens of spoofed network names, mimicking the most common public networks in the city. I flooded the immediate area with signals disguised as free coffee shop Wi-Fi municipal transit networks and generic telecommunication hotspots. I watched the command terminal on my screen with absolute focus. The digital trap was set. Now I just had to wait for his devices to take the bait. 30 seconds later, a line of green text flashed across my screen. A device registered as a late-model smartphone had automatically initiated a handshake protocol with my spoofed network, believing it had found a legitimate public hotspot. 10 seconds after that, a high-definition smart dashcam connected to the exact same trap. The private investigator was officially on my network. I immediately routed his traffic through a transparent proxy. I had full, unrestricted root access to the unencrypted data flowing in and out of his devices. I opened a mirrored viewing window on my laptop, silently watching his smartphone screen in real time. He was frantically refreshing a messaging application, trying to force a text message to Bradley to go through. The message simply read, "Target is parked, no movement, bad signal here." I did not block his message. I let it sit in his outbox while I bypassed his basic lock screen security and executed a background script to completely clone his local storage drive. A progress bar appeared on my laptop, rapidly downloading the contents of his phone directly onto my encrypted hard drive. I pulled his call logs, his text message history, his GPS location data, and his entire photo gallery. The data transfer took exactly 4 minutes. The private investigator sat in his car just 50 yards away, completely oblivious that his entire digital life was being siphoned through the airwaves. When the download hit 100%, I immediately severed the connection. I powered down the network router and closed my laptop, plunging the interior of my SUV back into total darkness. The investigator would simply assume the weak public Wi-Fi signal had dropped. I sat in the quiet chill of the parking garage and opened the freshly downloaded master folder on my hard drive. The directory was heavily organized. I scrolled past the investigator's personal files and located a subfolder distinctly labeled with Bradley's name. Inside was a comprehensive surveillance log, documenting my movements over the past 48 hours. There were distant photos of me buying groceries, walking to my car, and standing in the lobby of Leo's daycare. But it was the secondary folder marked as legal briefing that caught my immediate attention. I opened the folder and clicked on the sole PDF document stored inside. The file opened to reveal a highly official, heavily formatted psychiatric evaluation. It bore the header of a prestigious private medical clinic located directly in the city center. I read through the clinical assessment with a rising sense of cold, calculating fury. The document was a masterclass in medical character assassination. It formally diagnosed me with severe treatment-resistant postpartum psychosis. It detailed fabricated instances of manic behavior, violent outbursts, and a complete detachment from reality. The evaluation concluded with a strong, urgent medical recommendation that I be immediately separated from my infant son for his own physical safety and placed under involuntary psychiatric hold. Bradley was not just trying to build a circumstantial case against me in family court. He was attempting to manufacture a medical emergency to bypass the legal system entirely and have me committed. I scrolled down to the very bottom of the document to find the authorizing signature. The evaluation required the endorsement of a licensed board-certified psychiatrist to carry any legal weight with a judge or law enforcement agency. The signature was stamped boldly in black ink across the signature line. I stared at the name, a sharp, humorless smile touching the corners of my mouth. Dr. William Evans was not an impartial, objective medical professional. He was Bradley's former college roommate, his longtime fraternity brother, and a man who had attended our wedding as a groomsman. Bradley had convinced his closest friend to falsify a catastrophic medical diagnosis to facilitate the kidnapping of my son. I saved the fabricated medical dossier directly to a secure encrypted cloud server. Bradley thought he was setting a trap to prove I was legally insane. Instead, he had just handed me the definitive proof of a criminal conspiracy. I did not go home after leaving the concrete parking garage. Going home meant playing defense, and my days of waiting for Bradley to strike were officially over. I pulled my SUV into the parking lot of a 24-hour diner, ordered a black coffee, and opened a secure browsing window on my laptop. Dr. William Evans operated a boutique psychiatric practice in the affluent heart of the financial district. His clinic catered exclusively to high-net-worth executives, offering discreet prescriptions and premium privacy for a massive retainer. Getting an appointment as a new patient usually took months of waiting and a referral from another elite physician. Getting an emergency consultation for a distressed corporate client paying entirely in cash, however, took exactly 3 minutes. I booked the first available slot for the following morning under the fictitious name Sarah Jenkins. At exactly 8 o'clock the next morning, I walked through the frosted glass doors of the clinic. The waiting room smelled of expensive sandalwood and polished leather. Ambient acoustic music played softly from hidden speakers. The receptionist, a young woman wearing a headset and a designer silk blouse, barely glanced up from her glowing monitor as I walked straight past her desk. "Ma'am," the receptionist called out, her tone dripping with manufactured customer service politeness. "You cannot go back there. The doctor is preparing for his first session." I ignored her completely. I marched down the softly lit hallway, my heels sinking into the plush carpet, and headed directly for the heavy oak door bearing Dr. Evans's nameplate. I turned the brass handle, stepped inside the expansive office, and pushed the door shut behind me until the locking mechanism clicked into place. William Evans sat behind a massive, custom-built glass desk. He was exactly the kind of man Bradley would have idolized in college. He was perfectly tanned, wearing a custom-tailored suit, and possessed an air of suffocating arrogance. He looked up from his tablet, a deep frown forming on his face. "You are not Sarah Jenkins," Evans stated, standing up and pointing a rigid finger toward the door. "This is a private medical office. You need to leave immediately before I have building security physically remove you." I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I simply walked over to the sleek leather guest chair opposite his desk and sat down, crossing my legs with absolute composure. "You can call security if you want, William," I said, maintaining direct, unwavering eye contact. "But I highly suggest you sit down and look at what I brought you. Because if security comes through that door, I will hand these documents directly to the police officers who will inevitably follow them." Evans hesitated. His hand hovered over the sleek intercom button on his desk. The absolute certainty in my voice made the arrogant annoyance drain from his face, replaced by a sudden creeping caution. He slowly lowered himself back into his ergonomic leather chair. I reached into my bag and pulled out the crisp, printed copy of the psychiatric evaluation I had downloaded from the private investigator's hacked hard drive. I tossed it onto the center of his pristine glass desk. "That is your signature at the bottom of the page," I stated clearly. "You formally diagnosed me with severe treatment-resistant postpartum psychosis. You legally recommended that I be involuntarily committed and separated from my infant son for his own physical safety." Evans swallowed hard. He looked at the document, but he refused to touch it. "I have never met you," he said, his voice losing its authoritative edge. "I do not know who you are." "I am Meredith," I replied smoothly. "Bradley's wife. The woman you just diagnosed with a catastrophic mental breakdown without ever conducting a single medical examination. You fabricated a clinical evaluation to help your college fraternity brother legally kidnap my child." It was a consultation based on detailed behavioral reports provided by a deeply concerned spouse, Evans stammered, attempting to hide behind medical jargon. Bradley described textbook manic episodes: sleeplessness, paranoia, erratic aggression. I provided an emergency preliminary assessment based on standard diagnostic criteria. "You provided a fraudulent medical cover-up for a crime," I corrected him. I reached back into my bag and pulled out a second document protected inside a clear plastic sleeve. I dropped it directly on top of his fake psychiatric evaluation. This is an independent toxicology report, I explained, watching his eyes dart toward the laboratory header. For the last 2 months, Bradley has been slipping concentrated prescription amphetamines into the milk I pumped for Leo. He poisoned me to induce the exact symptoms of paranoia and sleeplessness that he then described to you. I saved a batch of the contaminated milk and sent it to a private lab. The remaining color vanished from Dr. Evans' face. He looked at the toxicology report as if it were a live explosive. Sweat began to bead along his perfectly groomed hairline. I did not know about that, Evans whispered, his voice trembling. I swear to you, Meredith, I had no idea he was drugging you. He just asked for a favor. He said you were a danger to the baby. He paid me $50,000 in cash to expedite the paperwork. I leaned forward, resting my arms on the cool glass of his desk. This carries a mandatory minimum of 10 years in federal prison for medical fraud, I told him, my tone completely devoid of mercy. Add in conspiracy to commit kidnapping, child endangerment, and the immediate permanent revocation of your medical license. You are looking at spending the rest of your life in a concrete cell, William. Or you can testify that Bradley bribed you to fabricate the entire diagnosis. Evans was shaking now. The polished, wealthy medical professional had completely vanished, leaving behind a terrified, cornered coward. He looked frantically around his luxurious office, realizing he was about to lose everything he had ever built. "What do you want me to do?" he choked out, wiping his sweating forehead with a shaking hand. I pulled a blank sheet of his official clinic letterhead from a tray on his desk and slid a heavy fountain pen toward him. "You are going to write a full, unredacted confession," I instructed. "You are going to state the exact date Bradley contacted you, the exact amount of cash he paid you, and the explicit fact that you falsified my medical records at his direct request. You will sign it, date it, and stamp it with your medical seal." Evans picked up the pen. His hand was trembling so violently he could barely grip the metal barrel. He did not argue. He did not try to negotiate. The threat of a decade in federal prison completely shattered his loyalty to Bradley. He lowered his head and began to write, his breath coming in shallow, panicked gasps as he documented his own criminal conspiracy. 10 minutes later, he pushed the signed, stamped confession across the desk. I picked it up, read it thoroughly to ensure it contained every necessary detail, and tucked it safely into my folder, alongside the toxicology report and the forged evaluation. "Make good choices from here on out, William," I said, standing up and turning toward the door. I walked out of the office, down the plush hallway, and out of the clinic without looking back. Back in his office, the second the heavy oak door clicked shut, Dr. Evans lunged for his cell phone. His hands shook as he dialed Bradley's personal number, his chest heaving with sheer, unadulterated panic. The line rang twice before Bradley answered. "She knows everything," Evans practically screamed into the receiver, pacing frantically behind his glass desk. "She has the lab results from the milk, Bradley. She has the fake evaluation. She just stood in my office and threatened me with federal prison. Fix this immediately. Fix it right now, or I am calling the prosecutor and turning state's evidence." Bradley's phone was pressed so tightly against his ear that his knuckles turned white. He stood in the men's restroom, adjacent to the executive boardroom, listening to William Evans hyperventilate through the speaker. "She knows everything," Evans shrieked, his voice bordering on a sob. "She has the lab results from the milk. She has my confession. Fix this right now, Bradley, or I am calling the prosecutor and turning state's evidence." Bradley stared at his own reflection in the gold-framed mirror above the sink. He smoothed the lapels of his $3,000 suit. "Pull yourself together," William Bradley hissed, his tone dripping with utter contempt. "Do absolutely nothing. Do not call anyone. I am walking into my senior vice president promotion review in exactly 2 minutes. I will deal with my hysterical wife as soon as I secure my office on the top floor. Keep your mouth shut." He terminated the call without waiting for a response and shoved the phone into his pocket. Bradley was entirely convinced of his own invincibility. In his mind, I was just a minor, temporary inconvenience, a glitch he could easily overwrite. He stepped out of the restroom and pushed through the heavy frosted glass doors of the primary executive boardroom. The room smelled of expensive leather, polished mahogany, and concentrated power. 10 members of the bank's board of directors sat around the massive conference table. At the head of the table sat Marcus Thorne, the chief executive officer, an imposing man who did not tolerate failure. Bradley approached the podium with a practiced winning smile. He connected his sleek silver laptop to the room's primary presentation system. The massive digital screen behind him flickered to life, displaying a beautifully rendered title slide boasting record-breaking quarterly profits. "Gentlemen," Bradley began, projecting his voice with absolute arrogant confidence, "the financial projections I am about to show you will not only secure our regional dominance, but redefine our lending strategy for the next decade." 10 miles away, I sat in the driver's seat of my SUV parked in the shadow of a local library. My laptop rested on my steering wheel. A live mirrored view of Bradley's computer screen glowed brightly in front of me. I had embedded a remote access Trojan on his hard drive weeks ago right under his nose. I watched the cursor on my screen as Bradley clicked his presentation remote. Slide 2 appeared. It was a colorful bar graph detailing commercial loan acquisition. He was putting on a masterclass in corporate deception. I gave him exactly 4 minutes to build his momentum. I waited until I knew he had captured the absolute undivided attention of every single board member in that room. Then I placed my fingers on the keyboard and executed a manual override. In the boardroom, Bradley paced confidently in front of the screen. "As you can see by our Q3 performance," he stated smoothly, "our internal risk assessment algorithms are flawless." He clicked his remote to advance to slide 3. The screen did not show his projected revenue models. The bright corporate graphics vanished entirely, replaced by a scanned high-definition image of a legal document. It was the master promissory note for the $400,000 home equity line of credit. The signature line was highlighted in a glowing fluorescent yellow box, showcasing my perfectly forged signature. Bradley froze mid-step. His confident smile shattered instantly. He mashed the button on his presentation remote, desperately trying to advance the slide. Nothing happened. I had completely locked him out of his own operating system. Bradley Marcus Thorne said, his thick eyebrows pulling together in confusion. "What exactly are we looking at here?" "Just a minor technical glitch?" Sir Bradley stammered. A thin layer of sweat broke out across his forehead. He practically lunged for his laptop, his fingers flying wildly across the keyboard. He slammed the escape key. He tried to force a manual reboot. The machine refused to respond to him. I typed a new command into my terminal. The massive screen in the boardroom flashed, transitioning to a new document. This time, it was a certified internal bank ledger. It displayed a direct, unauthorized wire transfer of $400,000 originating straight from the bank's commercial reserve accounts. The receiving account was explicitly labeled with the corporate tax identification number for Trey's flagship fitness center. Next to the transfer log, a secondary window popped open on the screen. It was an internal IP tracking report. It definitively proved that Bradley's specific administrative credentials had been used to manually bypass the bank's mandatory collateral verification protocols to force the wire transfer through. The silence in the boardroom was absolute and suffocating. The air was entirely sucked out of the room. 10 powerful, wealthy men stared at the glaring, undeniable proof of federal wire fraud displayed in 60-inch high definition. Bradley backed away from his laptop, his chest heaving as panic finally overrode his arrogance. He looked like a cornered animal searching for an exit. "This is a cyber attack," Bradley shouted, his voice cracking violently. "My system has been compromised. Someone is deliberately attempting to frame me." Marcus Thorne stood up slowly from the head of the heavy mahogany table. All the color had completely drained from his face, leaving him looking sickly and pale. He did not look at the screen. He looked directly at Bradley with an expression of pure, unadulterated fury. Bradley Thorne said, his voice dropping to a dangerously quiet octave. "What is this?" Before Bradley could formulate a single lie, a heavy knock echoed through the room. The thick boardroom doors swung open instantly, refusing to wait for an invitation. 2 tall, unsmiling individuals, wearing dark tailored suits and carrying heavy briefcases, stepped over the threshold. They did not look like corporate clients. They possessed the cold mechanical authority of people who destroyed lives for a living. They reached into their breast pockets in perfect unison, pulling out leather wallets and flipping them open to display bright silver badges. Marcus Thorne, the lead agent, asked, projecting his voice across the silent room. "We are federal bank examiners with the United States Department of the Treasury. We received a highly detailed anonymous tip regarding severe internal collateral fraud and unauthorized disbursement of commercial reserves." The agent slowly shifted his gaze, locking his eyes directly onto Bradley, who was currently trembling behind the podium. "We need everyone to step away from their computers," the agent commanded. "This entire floor is now under a federal audit." The silence of my living room was absolute. I had drawn the heavy blackout curtains early in the afternoon and deliberately parked my SUV 3 blocks away in a visitor space. From the outside, the house looked completely deserted. Inside, I was sitting perfectly still in the high-backed leather armchair, tucked into the darkest corner of my home office. I was just waiting. The federal raid at the bank had undoubtedly sent immediate shockwaves through Bradley's entire network, and I knew exactly who would panic first. His mother had spent her entire life insulating her son from the consequences of his actions, and with federal examiners tearing through his hard drives, her protective instincts would rapidly mutate into survival mode. The heavy brass lock on the front door clicked loudly. Beatrice was not a subtle woman, even when committing a felony. She pushed the solid oak door open with enough reckless force to rattle the hinges. Her frantic, heavy footsteps echoed violently against the hardwood floor. She did not bother calling out my name or pretending to be a friendly visitor. She operated under the absolute assumption that I was out running errands, or perhaps already detained by her son's fabricated psychiatric authorities. I remained perfectly still, listening as she bypassed the kitchen and hurried down the hall. Her breath was coming in ragged, shallow gasps. She was moving with the erratic, terrifying energy of a cornered predator whose territory was suddenly collapsing. She stepped into my office, bringing the sharp, sour scent of nervous sweat and stale designer perfume with her. The room was bathed only in the pale, slanting light from the street lamps bleeding through the closed window blinds. I watched in absolute silence as Beatrice lunged directly for my mahogany desk. The woman who usually prided herself on pristine appearances and country club etiquette was completely unhinged. Her expensive silk blouse was wrinkled, her hair was disheveled, and her eyes darted around the room with manic intensity. She began yanking drawers open violently, shuffling through neatly filed folders and tossing tax returns and bank statements carelessly onto the floor. She was tearing my sanctuary apart, muttering frantically under her breath about international flight schedules and non-extradition countries. She was not just looking for leverage. She was looking for a way out, and she needed the ultimate bargaining chip to take with her. She was hunting for Leo's passport so she could flee the state with my baby. "You are looking in the wrong drawer, Beatrice," I said, my voice completely flat and devoid of emotion. Beatrice let out a sharp, terrified shriek. She spun around so fast she slammed her hip against the heavy edge of the desk. She clutched her chest, her eyes wide and wild as they locked onto my silhouette in the corner of the room. I did not stand up. I simply raised my right hand, letting the faint ambient light catch the gold foil of my son's passport, resting loosely between my fingers. "Give that to me right now," Beatrice demanded. Her voice shook with adrenaline, but the underlying malice was unmistakable. She took a step toward me, her hands curling into tight, aggressive fists. "Bradley called me from the bank. The feds are tearing his office apart. They froze everything. My accounts, the house, the family trust funds. You did this. You vindictive, jealous little monster. You destroyed my entire family." I simply handed the authorities a flashlight, Beatrice. I corrected her smoothly, not moving an inch. "Your son built the house of cards. I just showed the federal government exactly where the structural flaws were located." Beatrice's eyes darted frantically around the room, desperately searching for a way to regain control of the situation. Her gaze landed on a heavy, solid crystal vase resting on the credenza next to the door. Without a single second of hesitation, she lunged forward and grabbed the thick glass by its neck. She did not raise the weapon toward me. Instead, she lifted the heavy crystal high above her own head. "You are going to pick up your phone right now," Beatrice hissed, her face contorting into a mask of pure, unadulterated madness. "You are going to call whoever you spoke to at the Treasury Department, and you are going to tell them you fabricated those financial documents. You are going to tell them you are suffering from severe postpartum psychosis, and that you stole Bradley's administrative credentials in a manic delusional episode to frame him." I remained firmly seated in my chair. I did not blink. I did not reach for my phone. "And what exactly happens if I refuse your demands?" I asked, maintaining a tone of clinical curiosity. "If you refuse," Beatrice snarled, her knuckles turning bone white around the neck of the crystal vase, "I am going to smash this heavy glass repeatedly into my own skull. I will break my own nose. I will shatter my own cheekbone. And then I will run screaming into the street covered in my own blood, telling the police that my unhinged, psychotic daughter-in-law tried to brutally murder me when I came over to check on my grandson. Who do you honestly think they will believe, Meredith? The respected wealthy society matron, or the unstable woman with a documented psychiatric evaluation currently sitting on a doctor's desk?" She smiled, a wicked, triumphant grin spreading across her face. She honestly believed she had completely outmaneuvered me. She believed she possessed a level of ruthless, sacrificial dedication to her son that I could never possibly match. I slowly stood up from the leather chair. I smoothed the front of my shirt and took a single deliberate step forward. I did not reach for my phone. I simply raised my index finger and pointed toward the ceiling directly above her head. "I highly recommend you look at the smoke detector, Beatrice," I said, my voice dropping to a deadly echoing whisper. Beatrice frowned, her triumphant smile faltering as her eyes flickered upward. Mounted perfectly flush against the white drywall was a brand new sleek circular device. A tiny steady red light pulsed faintly from its dark center. "I upgraded the entire home security system yesterday afternoon," I explained, watching the blood rapidly drain from her face until she looked like a ghost. "That device contains a high-definition wide-angle camera with an integrated audio microphone. And it is currently live streaming every single word you just said and every single move you just made directly to my attorney's secure cloud server." The heavy crystal vase slipped from Beatrice's trembling fingers and crashed onto the hardwood floor, shattering into 1,000 irredeemable pieces. The shattered crystal glittered across the hardwood floor like broken diamonds. Beatrice stared at the ruined vase, her chest heaving as the grim reality of her situation finally breached her formidable arrogance. She looked up at the blinking smoke detector, then slowly back at me. I gestured toward the front door. "I highly suggest you leave my house before I decide to press formal charges for breaking and entering," I told her, my voice echoing in the quiet room. She did not argue. She did not offer a single parting threat. She turned and practically ran for the exit, leaving the heavy oak front door wide open in her frantic haste to escape the trap she had walked right into. I swept up the glass and poured myself a cup of black coffee. The day was far from over, and the first domino had only just fallen. Less than an hour later, the doorbell chimed aggressively. I checked the security feed on my tablet. It was Trey. His usual arrogant, aggressively confident posture was completely eradicated. He looked utterly disheveled, sweating through his tight designer polo shirt, pacing back and forth on my front porch like a trapped animal. I walked to the foyer, disabled the deadbolt, and pulled the door open. Trey did not wait for an invitation. He pushed past me into the entryway, his eyes wild with unadulterated panic. "The IRS just raided my gym. Meredith," he blurted out, his voice cracking violently. "Federal agents kicked the doors in. They seized the servers, confiscated the physical ledgers, and froze every single business and personal account under my name. They are threatening me with 20 years in federal prison for wire fraud and money laundering." I closed the front door and leaned back against it, calmly crossing my arms. "That sounds like a significant and highly complicated problem for you, Trey," I said, keeping my tone completely devoid of sympathy. He ran a trembling hand over his face, leaving a streak of sweat across his forehead. "It was Bradley," he pleaded, stepping closer, but maintaining a careful distance. "Bradley set the entire scheme up. He used my business accounts to funnel the stolen money directly from his commercial reserves. He promised me it was completely untraceable. He swore it was a brilliant investment strategy that would make us all rich. And Sydney, my own wife, she pushed me into agreeing. She wanted the lifestyle, the money, the country club status. They played me Meredith. You have to believe me. I walked past him into the living room and sat down on the leather sofa, placing my phone face up on the glass coffee table. I believe you are a coward who got caught, I corrected him coldly. But your distinct lack of moral fiber might actually be useful to me right now. Trey followed me, his desperate eyes locking onto the phone. What do you want? He asked, his voice dropping to a pathetic whine. I will do anything. Just tell your people I was an unwitting pawn. Tell your lawyers to back off my accounts so I can mount a defense. I picked up the phone and opened the voice recorder application. I will contact my forensic accountant and have her draft a formal letter of leniency to the lead IRS investigator, I offered smoothly. I will explicitly state that you were manipulated and financially coerced by Bradley, which might shave a decade off your impending sentence. But in exchange, I want a complete, unedited, and fully recorded confession right here and right now. I want every single intricate detail of Bradley's master plan. And most importantly, I want you to explicitly detail his strategy regarding the drugs in my almond milk. Trey hesitated, his eyes darting toward the hallway as if looking for a sudden escape route. He knew confessing to the drugging crossed the invisible line from financial corporate crime into severe, premeditated felony assault. But the immediate terrifying threat of federal prison vastly outweighed his loyalty to anyone else. He collapsed into the armchair opposite me and nodded frantically. I tapped the record button. A bright red timer began ticking upward on the screen. Speak clearly, I commanded. Trey took a ragged breath. Bradley planned everything 6 months ago. He began, his voice shaking visibly. He knew you were getting suspicious about the missing funds and his erratic behavior. He needed you entirely out of the picture, but he could not risk a messy, protracted divorce where your lawyers would inevitably audit his offshore accounts. He needed you to look legally insane. Go on, I prompted, keeping my expression entirely neutral. He bought the sedatives online using anonymous cryptocurrency. Trey continued, the words spilling out of him in a desperate, unstoppable rush. He specifically chose a heavy industrial tranquilizer that perfectly mimics the symptoms of severe postpartum depression and psychotic detachment. He detailed his plan to me and Sydney during a private dinner at our house. He laughed about how easy it was. He said he was crushing the pills and mixing them into the organic almond milk you drank every single morning. He boasted that you were so exhausted from caring for Leo that you never even noticed the chalky texture. And Sydney's role in this, I asked, steering him precisely where I needed him to go. Trey did not even pause to protect the woman he married. Sydney helped him coordinate the entire timeline. Trey confessed rapidly, eager to shift the blame. She was the one who researched and suggested calling Child Protective Services once the drugs fully built up in your system. She mapped out exactly what symptoms the state caseworkers would look for to mandate a removal. She actively told Bradley to make sure he recorded you on his phone when you were disorientated and stumbling. They wanted to have you involuntarily committed to a locked psychiatric facility so Bradley could assume total uncontested custody of Leo and completely liquidate your shared assets while you were locked away. Trey leaned forward, clasping his hands together in a pathetic, pleading gesture. That is everything, Meredith. I swear to God. I just let them use my corporate accounts for the wire transfers. I never touched the drugs. It was all Bradley and Sydney. They are greedy, vicious sociopaths. Now please, you promised me the letter of leniency. I reached forward and calmly tapped the stop button on my phone. The screen flashed briefly, confirming the high-definition audio file was securely saved and automatically backed up to my encrypted cloud storage. I looked at Trey, allowing a slow, glacial smile to finally break across my face. I genuinely appreciate your honesty, Trey, I said quietly. But there is one minor, rather crucial detail I neglected to mention before we started this little recording session. Trey frowned, his panic returning instantly to his widened eyes. What detail? I did not answer him directly. Instead, I shifted my gaze directly over his shoulder, looking toward the heavy shadows of the kitchen doorway. "You can come out now," I said, projecting my voice clearly into the silent house. Trey froze completely. The remaining blood drained from his face as he slowly mechanically turned his head to look behind him. Stepping out from this darkness of the kitchen, her face a rigid mask of absolute horrified devastation, was Sydney. I had invited her over 20 minutes before Trey arrived, promising her a peaceful private resolution to our ongoing conflict. She had been standing there in the shadows the entire time, listening in total silence, as her husband desperately and thoroughly threw her under the bus to save himself from federal prison. Sydney's horrified gasp and Trey's pathetic stammering apologies faded into irrelevance the moment I walked out of my living room, leaving their marriage to implode in spectacular fashion. I had no time to stay and watch the rats tear each other apart. The real battle, the final confrontation that would secure my son's safety forever, was scheduled for the following morning. The fluorescent lighting of the family court building was harsh, sterile, and unforgiving. I sat at the petitioner's table next to my attorney, Evelyn Vance, a ruthless, brilliant woman known for dismantling corporate titans before her morning coffee. Across the wide aisle sat Bradley. He had dressed impeccably in a tailored charcoal suit, his hair deliberately styled to look slightly disheveled to convey the exact right amount of parental distress. He refused to look in my direction. The courtroom drama. The emergency ex parte hearing was called to order by Judge Harrison, a veteran of the family court system who possessed a notoriously low tolerance for theatrics. Unfortunately for the judge, Bradley had prepared the performance of a lifetime. When Bradley took the stand, it was a masterclass in psychological manipulation. He gripped the edges of the wooden witness box, his knuckles turning stark white, and let a single perfectly timed tear slide down his cheek. He spoke in a trembling, hushed voice about how deeply and profoundly he loved me, but how my mental health had rapidly and violently deteriorated since Leo's birth. He painted a tragic, terrifying picture of a woman entirely losing her grip on reality. He claimed to the court that I was hallucinating, suffering from severe paranoid delusions, and exhibiting aggressive, unpredictable outbursts that actively endangered our infant son. His high-priced lawyer stood beside him, nodding sympathetically, before producing a neatly bound stack of documents and presenting them to the judge as irrefutable medical proof. "Your Honor," Bradley choked out, burying his face in his hands and allowing his shoulders to shake. "I am begging you. I love my wife, but she is completely insane. She needs to be locked in a secure psychiatric facility for her own safety, and I need temporary sole custody to protect my son before she does something irreversible." The performance was so profoundly convincing that a heavy, sympathetic silence blanketed the courtroom. The court stenographer looked at him with genuine pity. Bradley's attorney cast a smug, triumphant glance in my direction. They honestly believed they had already won. They thought I was arriving unarmed. The reversal. I did not flinch. I did not cry. I sat with the absolute stillness of a predator waiting for the steel trap to snap shut. Evelyn stood up. She did not raise her voice. She did not engage in theatrical objections. She simply approached the bench with a sleek leather portfolio and began to dismantle Bradley's entire reality piece by meticulously verified piece. "Your Honor." Evelyn began, her tone cutting through the quiet room like a scalpel. "My client's husband has indeed painted a harrowing picture. However, the erratic symptoms he described are not the result of postpartum psychosis. They are the direct pharmacological result of systemic chemical poisoning." Bradley's head snapped up. The weeping victim facade vanished instantly, replaced by a flash of genuine, unadulterated panic. Evelyn handed the first document to the bailiff, who passed it up to the judge. "This is a certified toxicology report from an independent state-approved laboratory. It definitively proves that Meredith's blood, along with the organic almond milk she consumed daily in her home, contained dangerously high sustained levels of a heavy industrial tranquilizer. A tranquilizer that her husband secretly purchased online using an untraceable cryptocurrency account linked directly to his personal IP address. Judge Harrison's sympathetic expression evaporated in an instant, replaced by a dark, severe scowl as he reviewed the stamped lab results. Bradley's lawyer shot to his feet, objecting wildly, claiming the documents were fabricated and demanding they be stricken from the record. Evelyn simply smiled, a cold, terrifying smile, and produced her second piece of evidence. To address opposing counsel's desperate concern regarding fabrication, Evelyn continued smoothly. I submit Exhibit B, a sworn, notarized, and fully verified confession from Dr. William Evans. Dr. Evans explicitly admits to this court that he never once evaluated my client. He admits that Bradley coerced him into forging the psychiatric diagnosis presented to this court today entirely to facilitate a fraudulent involuntary commitment. The silence in the courtroom was no longer sympathetic. It was utterly suffocating. Bradley physically recoiled in the witness stand, his face turning an ashen, sickly gray. He looked frantically toward the heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom, desperately searching for an exit that did not exist. But Evelyn was not finished. She placed a small silver flash drive onto the evidence tray. Finally, Your Honor, we submit a complete high-definition audio confession from Bradley's primary accomplice in his financial fraud, Trey. In this unedited recording, Trey explicitly details the entire premeditated conspiracy. He outlines exactly how Bradley orchestrated the daily poisoning, how he planned to use the fabricated medical emergency to secure sole custody of their son, and how he intended to liquidate the family assets while his wife was securely locked inside a psychiatric ward. The judgment judge. Harrison did not even need to listen to the audio file. The sheer weight of the certified interlocking evidence resting on his desk was absolute. He slowly looked up from the documents and fixed his gaze directly on Bradley. The judge's eyes were practically burning with righteous, professional fury. Bradley opened his mouth, stammering, trying to formulate a lie, a defense, anything to stop the concrete walls from closing in around him. Nothing but a pathetic, strangled wheeze came out. His high-priced attorney silently stepped away from the podium, visibly distancing himself from the toxic fallout of his client. Mr. Evans. Judge Harrison rumbled, his voice echoing through the chamber with absolute terrifying authority. In my 20 years on the bench, I have rarely encountered such a grotesque, calculated display of domestic terrorism. The judge struck his wooden gavel with a deafening crack. I am denying your petition for custody in its entirety. I am granting Meredith sole legal and physical custody of her son effective immediately. Furthermore, I am issuing a permanent, heavily enforced restraining order against you. You are to have zero contact with your wife or your child. Bradley collapsed back into the witness chair, completely broken. His perfectly crafted life shattered into pieces he could never put back together. And lastly, Judge Harrison added, leaning over the bench with a look of pure, unmasked disgust, I am personally forwarding this entire case file, including these toxicology reports and recorded confessions, directly to the District Attorney's Criminal Division. You are not just losing your son today, Mr. Evans. You are going to face a grand jury for attempted poisoning and felony assault. The air in the civil courtroom was stale and heavy with the distinct scent of polished oak and impending ruin. Bradley looked entirely different from the arrogant executive who had tried to have me committed just weeks prior. He was currently out on bail awaiting his criminal trial for federal wire fraud and attempted felony assault. The stress had hollowed out his cheeks and stripped the confident shine from his eyes. His tailored suit hung loosely on his shrinking frame. Despite his terrifying reality, he still clung to one final desperate delusion. He honestly believed he could financially destroy me in the divorce asset division. Bradley had hired a notoriously aggressive divorce attorney named Richard Sterling, a man who specialized in burying spouses in endless, suffocating litigation. Sterling stood at the podium, puffing his chest out as he addressed the judge. He painted a picture of me that was so profoundly inaccurate, it bordered on comical. He confidently described me to the court as a financial parasite. He stated that I was a completely jobless dependent who had contributed absolutely nothing of monetary value to the marriage. He argued that Bradley had been the sole provider, the financial engine of our household, and the only reason I had a roof over my head. Because Bradley's banking career was now permanently destroyed by the pending federal indictments, Sterling audaciously demanded that I be stripped of all marital assets. He formally requested that our home be liquidated immediately. He demanded that the entirety of the equity be awarded to Bradley as spousal support to cover his exorbitant criminal defense fees, arguing that a jobless housewife had no means or right to maintain such a property. He concluded his grand speech by stating that I should walk away with nothing but my personal belongings, as that was exactly the value I had brought into the relationship. I sat next to Evelyn, my hands folded neatly in my lap. I did not interrupt. I did not show a single flash of anger. I just let Sterling talk until he had dug a hole so incredibly deep his client would never be able to crawl out of it. When Sterling finally took his seat with a smug, self-satisfied smirk, the judge turned to our table. Evelyn stood up slowly. She did not carry a thick binder of arguments or a stack of legal precedents. She simply picked up a single slender manila folder. She walked to the center of the room and handed one copy to the judge and another directly to Sterling. "Your Honor," Evelyn said, her voice echoing clearly across the silent courtroom. "Opposing counsel has spent the last 10 minutes loudly concerning himself with my client's lack of traditional employment. He has demanded spousal support and the total liquidation of my client's home under the false assumption that she is entirely reliant on his client's now non-existent income. I would like to formally submit Meredith's verified financial disclosure to correct this rather embarrassing misunderstanding." The judge opened the folder. He adjusted his reading glasses and scanned the top page. The ambient noise in the courtroom seemed to evaporate completely. The silence became absolute, heavy, and intensely suffocating. The judge looked up, his eyes widening marginally as he stared directly at me, and then he looked over at Bradley's table. Sterling had opened his copy of the disclosure. The smug, condescending sneer practically melted off his face. His mouth fell open slightly as his eyes darted back and forth across the columns of numbers. He flipped to the second page, his hands beginning to tremble visibly, struggling to comprehend the certified bank seals and wealth management signatures validating the document. For the record, Evelyn stated smoothly, ensuring every single person in the room heard the exact details. My client does not require traditional employment because she is entirely financially independent. 5 years ago, prior to ever meeting her husband, Meredith developed a highly specialized proprietary data encryption software. She sold the exclusive rights to that software to a multinational technology conglomerate. The proceeds from that sale were immediately placed into a heavily fortified blind trust. Bradley's head snapped up. His bloodshot eyes locked onto me wide with sudden, absolute shock. As the court can see from the certified statements provided, Evelyn continued without missing a single beat that blind trust has compounded over the years. My client is the sole beneficiary and absolute owner of a portfolio currently valued at just over $8 million. She purchased the marital home entirely with her own funds, placing Bradley on the deed merely as a courtesy. I watched the realization hit Bradley with the physical force of a runaway freight train. I could practically see the frantic, terrifying mathematics executing in his mind. He had spent months orchestrating a highly illegal, wildly dangerous conspiracy. He had stolen my administrative credentials to manually force a fraudulent loan through his own bank. He had systematically poisoned his own wife with an industrial tranquilizer. He had risked decades in a federal penitentiary, and he had done all of it just to secure $400,000 for his friend's failing fitness center. He had utterly destroyed his career, his marriage, and his freedom for $400,000 while he was sleeping in the same bed as a woman worth $8 million. The psychological weight of his own monumental stupidity crashed down on him. Bradley slumped forward in his chair, his hands gripping his hair as a strange, strangled sound escaped his throat. It was a noise of pure, agonizing defeat. He had thought he was the smartest person in the room, the untouchable mastermind manipulating his dependent, helpless wife. He was just realizing that he was the pawn blinding himself with his own insufferable greed and arrogance. "Furthermore, Your Honor," Evelyn said, driving the final definitive nail into the coffin. Because this blind trust was established prior to the marriage, and because the funds were never once commingled with any joint accounts, this $8 million fortune is completely and legally shielded from this divorce proceeding. Bradley is entitled to absolutely 0% of it. He cannot touch the principal, he cannot touch the interest, and he certainly cannot claim a single cent of it for spousal support to fund his criminal defense. Sterling slowly placed the folder down on the table. He did not say a word. He did not object. He simply stared at his client with a look of profound professional disgust. He knew immediately that he was never going to get paid. The judge cleared his throat, closing the folder with a sharp, decisive snap. It appears the petitioner is more than capable of maintaining the residence without the respondent's assistance, the judge stated dryly. I am denying the request for spousal support in its entirety. The marital home will remain in Meredith's possession, and the respondent will assume full liability for his own legal debts. Bradley did not look up. He sat there staring blankly at the polished wooden table, completely paralyzed by the realization of his own catastrophic greed. He had thrown away everything for a pathetic fraction of the wealth he could have shared had he simply been a decent, honest human being. I picked up my purse and walked out of the courtroom, not looking back, leaving him entirely alone to face the devastating consequences of his own choices. Walking out of that civil courtroom was like stepping into a new dimension. The air tasted cleaner, the sunlight felt sharper, and the suffocating tension that had defined my life for the past year was entirely gone. I had sole custody of my son, an ironclad permanent restraining order, and the unassailable freedom of my $8 million fortune. Bradley, on the other hand, had nothing but the crushing weight of his impending criminal trials and the devastating realization that his own insufferable greed had orchestrated his absolute ruin. I spent the next 2 weeks settling into my new highly secured townhouse overlooking the river. Evelyn finalized the protective orders, and my cybersecurity team thoroughly scrubbed my digital footprint. I was legally and financially untouchable, or so I logically thought. Narcissism is a terminal disease of the mind. It completely overrides logic, self-preservation, and basic survival instincts. For Bradley and his mother, Beatrice, their perceived social status was their oxygen. The objective reality of their situation, bankrupt, facing federal indictments, and publicly humiliated in family court, was simply too catastrophic for their fragile elitist egos to process. So they consciously chose delusion. They decided to pretend none of it was happening. Months ago, long before the IRS raids and the damning toxicology reports, Beatrice had booked the grand ballroom at the Oakwood Country Club for Leo's first birthday. It was an obscenely expensive, highly publicized event, designed exclusively for their high society friends to marvel at the flawless Evans family legacy. A rational person facing decades in federal prison would cancel the caterers, refund the deposit, and immediately hire a criminal defense attorney. Beatrice and Bradley decided to double down. To them, social death was a fate far worse than a federal penitentiary. I was sitting in my living room watching Leo play happily on a plush rug when my phone vibrated against the marble coffee table. It was an unregistered number utilizing a scrambled IP address to bypass the digital blocks my security team had installed. Bradley was directly violating the permanent restraining order. The text message was a masterpiece of desperate cornered aggression. He informed me that the country club party was proceeding exactly as planned this coming Saturday at noon. He demanded that I arrive with Leo wearing an appropriate designer dress and play the role of the happily recovering wife. Bradley needed his wealthy, influential friends to believe that my recent departure was nothing more than a temporary private hurdle. He needed the optics of a stable, unified family to leverage character witnesses for his upcoming federal sentencing. Then came the extortion. If I refused to play my part, if I failed to deliver his son to the grand ballroom for the photographic evidence he desperately required, he would destroy my professional empire. During the months he had secretly drugged my almond milk, Bradley had recorded numerous videos of my chemically induced breakdowns. He had carefully edited the footage, splicing together audio clips of me screaming, crying, and behaving erratically. He threatened to leak the doctored media directly to the local press and every major technology blog in the industry. He claimed he would spin a narrative that the brilliant software developer was actually a violently unstable, dangerous addict. He wanted to tank my reputation and force the multinational conglomerate that bought my proprietary software to publicly distance themselves from me. I read the message 3 times. A normal person would have panicked. A normal person would have immediately forwarded the threat to their attorney, and the police, letting the authorities drag Bradley out of his rented apartment in handcuffs for violating a protective order and attempting digital extortion. But sending him to a jail cell early felt entirely too merciful. Bradley wanted a public spectacle. He wanted an audience. He wanted to use the elite judgmental members of the Oakwood Country Club as his personal jury to validate his pathetic existence. I decided to grant him his wish. I walked into my home office and booted up my primary workstation. I did not need to scramble to protect my reputation. My cybersecurity team had already identified the doctored files on Bradley's seized servers weeks ago. I knew exactly what he possessed, and more importantly, I knew exactly what he did not know. He did not know that Trey's full unedited confession explicitly detailed the creation of those fake videos. He did not know that I had acquired the security footage from his mother's gated community, proving Beatrice was fully aware of the financial fraud. He did not know that I held the ultimate undeniable proof of their collective systemic criminality. I opened a secure encrypted folder on my desktop. I carefully selected the most devastating files I had amassed over the past month. I copied the high-definition audio of Trey crying in my living room, admitting that Bradley poisoned my food and planned to have me involuntarily committed. I copied the signed, notarized confession from Dr. Evans, admitting to the fabricated psychiatric hold. I copied the horrific, unredacted financial ledgers, detailing exactly how Bradley had stolen money from his own clients to fund his mother's lavish lifestyle, along with the high-resolution photographs of the IRS agents raiding Trey's gym. I transferred all of it onto a sleek silver USB drive. It was a digital guillotine perfectly designed to execute the Evans family legacy in front of the exact people they were desperately trying to impress. Saturday morning arrived with a crisp, clear sky. I dressed with meticulous surgical precision. I bypassed the modest conservative dresses Bradley had always preferred me to wear. I chose a striking emerald green sheath dress that projected absolute unapologetic power. I applied my makeup to highlight the sharp angles of my face, leaving behind the exhausted, pale victim Bradley thought he could still control. I looked like a woman who owned an $8 million fortune. I looked like a woman who held the world in the palm of her hand. I picked up my phone and opened the encrypted text thread. Bradley was sitting at the country club right now, sweating through his tailored suit, terrified that I would not show up, terrified that his carefully constructed illusion was about to permanently shatter. I typed my response with a steady, perfectly calm hand. I wouldn't miss it for the world. I dropped the phone onto the counter, picked up my designer handbag, and slipped the silver USB drive into the interior pocket. The Oakwood Country Club ballroom was a monument to old money and desperate pretension. Vaulted ceilings, crystal chandeliers, and a meticulously arranged champagne tower caught the mid-morning light. A string quartet played a delicate, sanitized rendition of a classical symphony in the corner. I handed my keys to the valet and stepped through the double oak doors, the emerald green silk of my dress brushing against the polished marble floor. Bradley and Beatrice were positioned near the center of the room, flanked by local politicians, bank executives, and society matrons. Bradley held Leo, who was dressed in a ridiculously stiff little suit. Beatrice was dabbing at her dry eyes with a lace handkerchief, leaning in to whisper tragically to a wealthy investor's wife. They were playing the martyrs, spinning a narrative of quiet, dignified suffering to the exact people Bradley needed for character references. They were utterly convinced that the sheer weight of their social standing would shield them from reality. I glided into the ballroom. The heavy gold-hinged doors shut behind me with a muted thud, But the effect on the room was immediate. The polite murmur of conversation rippled then stalled completely. Heads turned, glasses paused halfway to lips. I did not look like the heavily medicated psychotic husk Bradley had described to them. I looked radiant, sharp, and entirely untouchable. I walked straight toward the center of the room, my heels clicking a steady rhythmic beat against the pristine floor. Bradley saw me, and for a fraction of a second the mask slipped. His jaw locked, and his eyes widened in sheer panic before he forced a bright plastic smile onto his face. He shifted Leo in his arms, playing the role of the relieved, supportive husband. Before I reached them, Sydney stepped into my path. She looked absolutely hollowed out. Her designer dress hung awkwardly on her frame, and the dark circles under her eyes could not be hidden by expensive concealer. Her marriage to Trey was currently disintegrating in real time after his recorded confession, and the venom in her glare was palpable. She opened her mouth to speak, to hiss some desperate threat to maintain her crumbling illusion of control, but I did not even break my stride. I looked right through her, treating her with the absolute indifference one reserves for a smudge on a windowpane. She shrank back, rendered entirely powerless by my silence. I reached Bradley and gracefully took Leo from his arms. My son beamed, burying his face in my neck. Bradley leaned in, his teeth bared in a rigid smile, and muttered under his breath, ensuring no one else could hear. "Play along, Meredith. You smile, you nod, and you act grateful to be here, or I send the videos right now." I smiled back at him, brilliant and warm for the benefit of the watching crowd. "I am perfectly happy to be here, Bradley," I replied smoothly. "It is a beautiful party." Beatrice hovered nearby, her eyes darting nervously toward my designer handbag. She knew I had walked out of a courtroom entirely victorious, but her arrogance convinced her I would never cause a public scene in front of her country club peers. She thought her social territory was a shield. She was about to find out it was a cage. An hour passed in a haze of forced pleasantries and clinking glasses. I played the part flawlessly, mingling with the guests, accepting their thinly veiled pity with graceful, knowing smiles. Bradley relaxed slightly, his chest puffing out as he regained his confidence. He actually believed his blackmail had worked. He believed he still held the reins. Then the string quartet faded out. Beatrice stepped up to a small podium, set up next to a massive state-of-the-art projection screen they had rented to display tasteful baby photos. She tapped a microphone, commanding the room's attention. The crowd quieted. Beatrice gripped the edges of the podium, her voice trembling with perfectly manufactured emotion. "Thank you all for being here today to celebrate our darling Leo." She began, looking out over the sea of wealthy guests. "This past year has brought unexpected, profound challenges to our family. We have had to navigate incredibly difficult private medical hurdles." She paused, letting her gaze sweep mournfully over the crowd before landing on Bradley. "But through it all, my son Bradley has been a pillar of unwavering strength. He has carried the burden of this family. He has stepped up to protect his son and care for a partner who has been severely, tragically unwell. His devotion is a testament to the Evans family legacy." Polite, sympathetic applause rippled through the ballroom. People looked at me with varying degrees of pity and judgment. Bradley looked down, playing the humble, long-suffering hero. I handed Leo to his trusted nanny, whom I had specifically instructed to stand near the exit. I smoothed the front of my emerald dress, unclasped my handbag, and pulled out the sleek silver USB drive. I walked slowly, deliberately up to the podium. Beatrice froze, her hand tightening around the microphone. The polite applause died instantly. I did not ask for permission. I reached out and gently but firmly took the microphone directly from her trembling fingers. "Thank you, Beatrice, for those deeply moving words," I said, my voice echoing crystal clear across the silent ballroom. I turned to the massive projection screen, then looked back at the hundreds of staring faces. Bradley and his mother have certainly orchestrated an unforgettable year. In fact, I actually brought a video montage of Leo's first year to commemorate everything that has happened behind closed doors. Shall we play it? The AV technician, a young guy in a black polo shirt hired for the day, looked utterly bewildered as I handed him the silver drive. He glanced at Beatrice, who was frozen in a state of pale shock, and then back to me. I gave him a single authoritative nod. He plugged it into the console and tapped the keyboard. The heavy crystal chandeliers above us faded out, plunging the grand ballroom into sudden cinematic darkness. The massive projection screen flared to life, casting a harsh bluish-white glow over the hundreds of upturned faces. There was no soft acoustic lullaby. There were no pastel borders, no whimsical fonts, and absolutely no photos of a smiling baby covered in birthday cake. Instead, the crisp 4K resolution of the hidden nursery camera filled the screen. The timestamp in the lower right corner flashed in bright digital numbers, dating back to a Tuesday night 3 months prior. The room was deathly quiet as the audio kicked in, impeccably clear, bouncing off the vaulted ceilings of the Oakwood Country Club. Bradley's oversized face dominated the projection. He was standing directly over Leo's crib, holding a small, unmarked glass vial. The crowd watched in breathless silence as the digital version of my husband smirked into the darkness of the nursery. His voice, amplified through the state-of-the-art surround sound system, was chillingly casual. He explicitly detailed the dosage of the industrial tranquilizer he was using. He bragged to an off-screen tray about how easily it dissolved into my almond milk. He laughed as he described watching me stumble around the kitchen, proudly declaring how simple it was to manufacture a psychiatric breakdown when you controlled the medication. A collective horrifying gasp swept through the ballroom. It was the sound of 100 wealthy, perfectly manicured illusions shattering all at once. The video abruptly cut to a new timestamp. This time, Trey was pacing frantically across the nursery rug, sweating profusely in his gym clothes. He was holding a stack of banking documents. The audio captured every single panicked word as Trey confessed to the wire fraud. He openly discussed the fake commercial loan. He specifically named 3 senior executives at Bradley's bank, men who were currently standing in this very ballroom, wearing expensive tuxedos and holding flutes of vintage champagne. Trey practically screamed about how Bradley had bypassed internal security measures, forging my signature to illegally secure $400,000 to save his failing fitness center. I watched a senior bank executive standing near the ice sculpture turn the color of wet ash. The crystal champagne flute slipped from his trembling fingers, shattering violently against the polished marble floor. Nobody even flinched at the noise. They were entirely paralyzed by the screen. The footage cut one final time. Beatrice Evans sat elegantly in my plush nursery glider. She was holding a sleeping Leo against her chest, gently rocking back and forth. The visual was the picture of grandmotherly devotion, but the words coming out of her mouth were pure, unadulterated venom. She was speaking to Bradley, meticulously laying out the timeline to strip me of my child. Her cold, calculating laughter echoed through the country club she prized above all else. She detailed the exact legal maneuvering they would use once the tranquilizers finally pushed me into a forced psychiatric hold. She openly mocked my intelligence. She gloated about how easily they were going to sever my parental rights, lock me away in a facility, and retain total control of my assets to fund their lifestyle. When the clip finally ended, the screen faded to pitch black. The ballroom lights slowly flickered back on, illuminating a scene of absolute spectacular devastation. The silence was heavier than concrete. The society matrons who had just been weeping in sympathetic solidarity with Beatrice were now physically backing away from her, pulling their silk shawls tightly around their shoulders as if proximity to her would infect them with federal indictments. The bank executives were already pulling out their cell phones, frantically typing messages to their legal departments. Sydney stood near the back of the room, her hands covering her mouth, her eyes wide with a horrific blend of total vindication and absolute disgust. Beatrice was trembling violently. The color had completely drained from her face, leaving her heavily applied makeup looking like a tragic melting mask. Her carefully curated high society kingdom had just burned to the ground in less than 3 minutes, and her own peers were looking at her as if she were a monster. Bradley realized the game was entirely over. There was no spinning this. There was no public relations firm on Earth that could erase high-definition video evidence of federal wire fraud and attempted chemical assault broadcast directly to the local elite. His pristine, untouchable image was dead. The narcissist's brain cannot process absolute defeat. When the illusion shatters, all that remains is primal, unhinged rage, Bradley snapped. His face turned a violent shade of purple, the veins bulging dangerously against the collar of his tailored white shirt. He shoved violently past his horrified, paralyzed mother and stormed the podium. I stood my ground perfectly calm, my hands folded neatly in front of my emerald dress, watching him unravel into a complete lunatic. He grabbed the microphone stand with both hands, his knuckles turning white, and screamed into the mic. His voice was raw, desperate, and echoing with the total collapse of his sanity. He played the only card he thought he had left, the one chain he genuinely believed still bound me to his sinking ship. "You think you've won!" Bradley roared, spittle flying from his lips as he pointed a shaking finger directly at my face. "You're still going bankrupt. I tied the $400,000 debt to your name. You own that fraudulent loan. You're going down with me." Bradley's scream echoed off the vaulted ceilings of the grand ballroom, a raw, ugly sound that clashed violently with the refined elegance of the Oakwood Country Club. He stood just inches from me, his chest heaving, his face a mottled mask of desperation and misplaced triumph. Spittle flew from his lips as he pointed a shaking finger directly at my face. He honestly believed he had delivered a fatal blow. He genuinely believed that his fraudulent loan, the $400,000 he stole to save Trey's pathetic gym, was an anchor securely fastened around my neck. The entire ballroom held its collective breath. The elite crowd, the bank executives, the local politicians, the society matrons, they were all paralyzed, waiting for my reaction. They expected tears. They expected outrage. They expected me to crumble under the crushing weight of public financial ruin. I did not flinch. I did not take a single step back. I simply looked at him with the clinical, detached curiosity of a scientist observing a failed, chaotic experiment. Instead of panicking, I reached into my emerald designer handbag. My movements were slow, deliberate, and entirely devoid of fear. I bypassed my phone and withdrew a single crisp manila folder. I tapped the microphone I still held in my left hand, the sharp sound snapping the room back to reality. "You really should have hired a better corporate attorney, Bradley," I said, my voice echoing with icy, absolute clarity. "Or at the very least, you should have read the fine print of the deed." I handed the folder to the AV technician who was standing frozen at the edge of the stage. I gave him a curt, commanding nod. He swallowed hard, fumbled for a brief second, and then placed the document onto the digital scanner connected to the projection system. The massive screen behind me flickered. The horrifying video footage of Beatrice plotting in my nursery was instantly replaced by a high-resolution scan of a property deed. But it was not a standard residential deed. The text was stark black and undeniable. I stepped aside, ensuring Bradley had a perfect, unobstructed view of his own monumental stupidity. "You see, Bradley," I explained, pacing slowly across the polished stage. "Months before you decided to steal my administrative credentials, months before you started crushing up industrial tranquilizers into my morning coffee, my wealth management team executed a standard asset protection protocol. I transferred the title of the marital home, the property you so generously placed yourself on as a courtesy, entirely into an offshore corporate LLC. That LLC is managed exclusively by my blind trust." I watched Bradley's face. The violent, flushed red color began to drain away, rapidly replaced by a sickly, terrifying pale hue. His mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. His eyes darted wildly across the legal jargon projected on the screen, his banking background finally kicking in, translating the catastrophic reality of what he was reading. "When you stole my credentials," I continued, ensuring every syllable rang through the silent, captivated room. "And when you forged my personal signature on those commercial loan documents, the bank's underwriting software ran an automated collateral check. It is a standard, unavoidable procedure. But because Meredith Evans, the individual, had absolutely zero real estate assets tied to her personal Social Security number, the system instantly rejected the house as viable collateral. The room was so incredibly quiet, I could hear the hum of the projector and the ragged, shallow breathing of the man standing next to me. You were so rushed, Bradley. You were so desperate to push the money through your own branch manually that you entirely ignored the system's red flag warnings. You overrode the security protocols, assuming your status as a senior executive would shield you from internal audits. But banking algorithms do not care about your ego. They do not care about your country club memberships. They are programmed to secure the debt. When the primary collateral was rejected, the automated system immediately sought the next available viable asset tied to the loan application. It defaulted automatically to the guarantor. I turned my body away from Bradley, dismissing him entirely. I looked down into the crowd, my eyes locking directly onto Beatrice. She was standing exactly where I had left her, shivering in her designer silk dress, clutching her pearl necklace. Her eyes were wide with a creeping primal dread. She looked around at her wealthy friends, realizing in real time that they were no longer her peers. They were her audience. She had co-signed the original line of credit you used to set up the fraudulent transfer. I said, my voice dropping to a deadly conversational timbre. I walked to the edge of the stage, looking down at the woman who had spent the last year plotting to steal my child, lock me in a psychiatric ward, and liquidate my life. He did not mortgage my house. Beatrice, I stated the words, striking her with the physical force of a bullet. He mortgaged yours. A collective gasp ripped through the crowd. A senior vice president from Bradley's bank actually dropped his drink. The shattering crystal cut sharply through the heavy silence, splashing champagne across the shoes of a local politician who did not even bother to look down. Beatrice's mouth fell open in a silent scream of absolute horror. Bradley's accounts have been frozen by the IRS and federal investigators for weeks. I continued relentlessly, driving the final definitive nail into the coffin of the Evans legacy. The $400,000 loan went into immediate unrecoverable default. Because the loan was generated through fraudulent means and directly tied to an active federal investigation, the bank executed its standard asset reclamation protocol without delay. I looked dead at Beatrice, letting her absorb the absolute totality of her ruin. And because he defaulted, your estate goes into foreclosure at exactly 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. The psychological break was instantaneous. The ancestral home, the elite social status, the generational wealth she lorded over everyone she deemed beneath her, was all gone. It was evaporated by the blinding greed of the son she had weaponized against me. Beatrice let out a sound that did not even seem human. It was a blood-curdling, agonizing scream that tore through her throat and echoed violently off the crystal chandeliers. Her knees buckled beneath her. She collapsed entirely, hitting the polished marble floor in a heap of silk and pearls, her hands tearing frantically at her own hair as her flawless, privileged world finally burned to ash. The piercing wail of sirens shattered the dead silence of the Oakwood Country Club ballroom. Before a single guest could process the absolute destruction of Beatrice Evans, the room was bathed in a chaotic, pulsing glow. The heavy floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the manicured golf course suddenly flashed with alternating strobes of blinding red and blue. The authorities had not just arrived, they had surrounded the perimeter. The heavy oak double doors at the main entrance were thrown open with a violent crash that made the frozen string quartet drop their bows. A highly coordinated tactical team of federal agents and local police officers marched into the grand ballroom. They wore dark, tactical vests, their expressions carved from stone, instantly completely altering the atmosphere of the room. This was an environment built to cater to the ultra-wealthy, a sanctuary where consequence was historically bought off with a discreet check. The sight of armed federal agents marching across the polished marble floor broke whatever fragile illusion remained. The elite guests scrambled backward, desperate to put physical distance between themselves and the Evans family. The crowd parted instantly, treating Bradley and his collapsed mother as if they carried a highly contagious disease. The lead FBI agent, a tall, broad-shouldered man with zero patience for high society theatrics, bypassed the terrified catering staff and marched directly toward the stage. Bradley was still standing near the projection screen, his mouth opening and closing, as he stared at the flashing red and blue lights painting the walls of his ruined kingdom. The sheer gravity of his situation finally breached the thick walls of his narcissism. He took one step backward, his hands rising defensively in the air. Bradley Evans, the lead agent, announced, his voice booming over the ambient panic of the room. "You are under arrest." Bradley tried to speak. He tried to summon the arrogant, authoritative executive persona he had worn like a suit of armor his entire life. It failed entirely. A pathetic, strangled squeak escaped his throat as two agents grabbed his arms, spinning him around and slamming him face first against the polished wooden podium. The metallic click of handcuffs snapping shut around his wrists echoed sharply. The agent recited the charges with clinical, devastating precision. "You are being charged with multiple counts of federal wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, corporate embezzlement, and attempted felony assault by chemical poisoning. You have the right to remain silent. I highly suggest you use it." Bradley did not fight back. The fight had been completely drained out of him. The man who had spent a year systematically drugging his wife, gaslighting her, and attempting to steal her hard-earned fortune was reduced to a sobbing, hyperventilating shell. He was hauled off the stage, his tailored suit rumpled, and his face slick with terrified tears. Across the room, Trey attempted to blend into the terrified crowd, quietly edging his way toward the service exit near the kitchens. He did not make it far. Two local police officers intercepted him, grabbing him by the collar of his expensive tuxedo jacket. Trey did not possess Bradley's instinct for silent denial. As the officers slammed him against the wall to cuff him, he immediately began screaming, trying to negotiate his way out of federal prison right there in the middle of the ballroom. "I did not orchestrate the loan." Trey yelled frantically, looking at the agents. "It was Bradley. He did the paperwork. He bypassed the security. I just needed the money for the gym. He told me it was clean. He told me she would never find out." The officers ignored his cowardly display, hauling him backward toward the main entrance. "You are under arrest for money laundering and conspiracy to commit wire fraud," the officers stated, marching him out of the room. Sydney was left standing completely alone near the champagne tower. Her carefully curated country club life was disintegrating before her very eyes. Her husband was being dragged out in handcuffs, screaming confessions of federal crimes to anyone who would listen. Her social standing was permanently obliterated. She dropped her designer clutch to the floor and buried her face in her hands, her shoulders heaving with loud, ugly sobs. No one moved to comfort her. The society matrons she had tried so desperately to impress simply turned their backs, entirely disgusted by the radioactive fallout of her marriage. At the front of the room, Beatrice remained on the marble floor. She had not moved since the realization of her foreclosure struck her. The flashing police lights washed over her frozen, catatonic features. Her pearl necklace had broken when she collapsed, scattering expensive white beads across the floor like discarded teeth. She stared blankly at the ceiling, her mind completely broken by the reality of her situation. She was no longer a wealthy matriarch holding court over the local elite. She was a destitute homeless woman whose son was heading to federal prison. Her estate was gone. Her bank accounts were frozen. Her social network was currently watching her family be hauled away by the FBI. The psychological shock was absolute. She simply sat there, staring into the void, trapped in a hell of her own arrogant creation. I watched the entire scene unfold from the edge of the room. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I did not feel the need to scream or point or revel in their destruction. Sweet revenge does not require theatrics when the truth is sharp enough to cut through bone. I had simply handed them the rope, and they had eagerly, greedily tied their own nooses. The job was done. I turned away from the wreckage of the Evans family and walked calmly over to the nanny. She held Leo securely in her arms, shielding his eyes from the flashing lights. He was blissfully unaware of the absolute chaos surrounding him. I smiled at him, a genuine, warm expression that finally reached my eyes. I took my son into my arms and wrapped him securely in a soft, thick cashmere blanket I had brought for the ride home. He rested his head against my shoulder, safe, protected, and entirely mine. I turned toward the exit. The remaining guests, the bankers, the politicians, the wealthy elite who had judged me when I walked in, now parted from me like the Red Sea. They stepped back, giving me a wide, respectful berth. They looked at me with a profound mixture of awe and absolute terror. I did not acknowledge a single one of them. I pushed open the heavy oak doors and stepped out of the country club. The crisp, cool afternoon air hit my face, smelling of pine and absolute freedom. The police cruisers were parked haphazardly on the manicured lawn, but my private driver was waiting precisely where I had instructed, standing at attention next to my sleek black SUV. He opened the door for me. I stepped inside the quiet, luxurious cabin, settling Leo into his car seat. I buckled my seatbelt and leaned back against the leather headrest as the car pulled smoothly away from the curb, leaving the flashing lights and the ruined lives far behind in the rearview mirror. I was safe. I was wildly wealthy. I was entirely free. The nightmare was finally over. The profound lesson here is that our true value is never determined by the assessments of those who constantly underestimate us. Just like discovering the hidden potential in an abandoned building, we must recognize our own worth even when our family is blinded by favoritism or greed. True security and success come from having the courage to defend what is rightfully yours, and the wisdom to walk away from toxic dynamics. Never let anyone else's inability to see your potential dictate your future. Please share your own experiences with setting healthy family boundaries in the comments below.